Good morning. Thank you. So I was nearly late to my own conference this morning. So my wife and my son had to go home last night after the conference because he had a birthday party he was desperate to go to. My 13-year-old stayed with me, and this morning I was waiting for a room service to show up to give me some breakfast in my room, and realized I ordered it for my kid and forgot to order it for me. So I was nearly late to my own conference. We have another busy day today. However, because we are not dealing with Secret Service, we actually have a longer lunch, and we have 2 coffee breaks today to give you a little more time to stand up and stretch and move around. But we also have another fantastic day. Congressman Chip Roy will be here, Governor Bill Lee will be here, Senator David Perdue will be here, a host of other people will be here. Tonight we don't have any formal programming. I had several people ask me about tomorrow. We have in the past done a prayer breakfast on Sunday mornings, and we had a real hard time this year being able to rearrange stuff because we had to have the room ahead of time with the Secret Service and all, so we decided we weren't going to do anything in the morning. But safe travels to those of you I don't get to see tomorrow. But today's going to be another long day, but it'll be a great day. I really do also want to thank all of our sponsors. You can find their names on the back of the program. I never feel like I do an adequate job thanking all the sponsors. We had some individuals who were able to step up with us. Believe it or not, when the Secret Service came in and we started having to do extra stuff for the Vice President, suddenly the cost of the event kept going up. I was like, well, we got to go find some more sponsors to help us cover the costs. Otherwise, we're going to have a conference that immediately file bankruptcy. Thankfully, we had a number of folks who were able to step forward and help us, which has been fantastic. We could not have done the conference without all of our sponsors. I thank them tremendously. We're also a little more relaxed today because we don't have the Secret Service. I totally forgot there would be metal detectors yesterday. They almost didn't let me into my own conference because somebody who has my same name took my credential. Yeah, my parents are over here. So now, where do we go today? I don't just like to, the reason I do this format, by the way, is for years when I was at Red State, we always gave the same sort of conference where the candidate would speak up, they would come up, they would take the stage at a podium, they would give a speech. It would be the same speech they had given 5 or 6 other times. I would come up awkwardly on stage and interrupt them so that they would have to take questions from the crowd. And you never really learned anything. And I'm more and more mindful that the conservative movement has fallen away a lot from policy. And what is actually good policy? Good people makes good policy, but we also have to have some ideas. And sometimes I feel like we're still feeding from the same trough that we were feeding from in the 70s and the 80s. Where do we go with good ideas? How do we innovate? How do we take ideas like Ronald Reagan's tax cuts and repurpose them for the 21st century? And we need to have those discussions. And so I decided when we did this last year in Texas, I'm not going to let people give speeches anymore. I want people to sit down with me and actually have a conversation. Now, interestingly enough, the reason we let the Vice President give a speech instead of a conference is because they wanted to do it as an official event instead of a campaign event, which actually helped us in terms of having to cover costs. So we let him speak, and he's the Vice President. You don't turn the Vice President down speaking. But I asked everyone else to actually just sit down and have a conversation, whether it's the governor of Tennessee or Georgia or the various senators, to actually talk about issues. And for members of Congress, talk about the debt and deficit. If Republicans are the party of small government, why is the debt and deficit continuing to grow? I try not to be a jerk to people who cover their own costs to get here and sit on stage with me, so I'm not going to be in Tim Russert, Chuck Todd, or Jake Tapper in their face pulling up old quote stuff, but I really do want to talk about these sorts of things. What I want to talk about right now with someone who knows more about this issue than probably any other man, woman, or child in the world is 21st century taxation in the United States. The president and the Republicans were able to reform the tax code in the United States, but the tax code in the United States is still a massive, massive bill. It's a massive part of the United States Code. It is massive in terms of regulations. It is a massive part of our lives, where the government still believes they can control us and shape us and guide us in our lives through tax policy. So what do we do with it? How do we innovate? But it's not just at the federal level, it's also at the state level. You even see Republicans around the country now who have decided, even though we're in great economic times, the money is flowing, they still want to tax things. You're seeing states like California decide they're going to tax vaping because they tax cigarettes, or they're going to ban something through taxation by driving up the cost so much. You're seeing some Republicans decide they can change healthcare policy by taxing certain products. Which it's crazy to see Republicans caving on taxes. And my next guest holds their feet to the fire. Republicans are sometimes scared of him, and it's a really good thing because he'll send out a letter with his name on it saying you're raising taxes, and voters intuitively know if he says they're raising taxes, they're raising taxes. But what do we do in the 21st century? Well, to talk about it, please join me for a warm welcome for the President of Americans for Tax Reform, Grover Norquist. Thank you. So we're in the 21st century, and Republicans still frequently talk about the Reagan tax reforms of the 80s as if we need to cut the income tax, but we got a capital gains tax. We have Republicans around the country who do sales taxes, raise sales taxes all the time. Just as a start for the conversation, if you could, fill us in on your thinking. Where do we stand in tax policy in the 21st century?
Let's do a brief history. When Kennedy wanted to cut marginal tax rates, as Reagan did, almost very similar bill, Goldwater voted against it. And so the modern Republican Party was not always the party that opposed taxes and cut taxes. But during Reagan's political lifetime, Jack Kemp and other political leaders, activists around the country, it changed the direction of the Republican Party. We became the party that recognized marginal tax rates matter a lot. Lower rates do less damage to the economy. You have to raise some money, but you don't have to do it stupidly and destructively. And we are now divided out. Americans for Tax Reform, which was founded by Reagan, actually, and then he asked me to run it to help pass the '86 bill. We put together the pledge, ask candidates, federal, state, local office, to sign a written pledge to the American people, not, as Obama used to say, to me, but to the American people, that they will vote against and oppose all efforts to raise taxes. Since '94, when the Republicans ran with about 98% of all the candidates committing to the pledge, in the previous 60 years, the Republicans held the House and Senate for 4 of 60 years, 2 sessions of the House, 4 years. Since the Republicans became the party at the national level that would not raise your taxes, they may invade small countries they can't pronounce, but they will not raise your taxes, we have won the House and the Senate 2/3 of the years since then. So step one, be the party, the movement, the candidate that will not raise your taxes, which means you must be the candidate to reform government. Because the alternative to reforming government is just to raise taxes to pay for all the stupid stuff you used to do, and we got some new stupid stuff. No, it's good stuff. The good stuff's new. The old stuff may be stupid. We'll keep doing that. And I've got a good project. This Edsel's going to work, so we're going to raise taxes for that. Tax spending reform only comes when taxes are completely off the table, because if it's, how about taxes and spending, the left keeps focusing on the taxes, we never get to the spending restraint. But moving forward, we're moving towards a single rate taxing consumed income at a single rate one time. Right now we tax income many times: when you earn it, when you spend it, when you invest it, when it's inside a company, when you get a capital gain, when you're stupid enough to die. They keep coming back and taking bites out of the same apple. You want to tax income one time. Watch you earn it, tax it, go away. You don't have any interest in that person or that money after that point. Just tax it once. Second, single rate. This has nothing to do with fairness. Taxation is taking money from people who earned it and giving it to people who maybe didn't earn it. Fairness is that you can do it in a less destructive way. But the reason you want a single rate is that, and I'm originally from Massachusetts prior to emigrating to the United States. And there, and I'm staying. I'm not going back. They can't make me go back. We have a single rate tax, 5%. by Constitution in Massachusetts. And when the politician in Massachusetts wants to raise your taxes, they say, I've got a great idea, and you're all going to pay for it. And people say, then we're all listening, and it better be a good idea. And they really haven't been able to, they've actually let rates come down in recent history, not gone up in Ted Kennedy, George McGovern, deep blue Massachusetts. Illinois has a single rate tax, which is why, even though they're crazy on other taxes, the income tax is about 4 to 6%. It's not where California and other states are. So a single rate tax is difficult to raise because you cannot divide the American people into different groups and mug them one at a time, which is what Obama offered. I'm only going to tax the top 1 or 2%. The rest of you might want to step out of the room because this isn't going to be pleasant, but it's not you. So if you can't do that and you have to face everybody at once, it makes it tough to raise taxes. They have to really have a good reason. And we're moving in that direction. Just about everything that Trump did in his tax reform moved in the right direction. Did we do it all at once? No. Is there much more to do? Absolutely. Was that taking the corporate rate from 35%, which was the highest in the world, Germany was at 25. Communist China has a 25% tax. We were at 35. Our corporate rate was higher than France's, stupider than France, not where you want to be. So nobody had a rate as high as we did, and we took 35 down to 21, which puts us kind of in the middle. I mean, much better than where we were, but we have 4%, 4.5% state corporate taxes on average. Not every state has them. So you're really about 25% when you look at it. That's okay competitive, but Trump's goal of 15 is much better, and we got to get there. So I think we're moving in the right direction. We just need a House and a Senate to do it.
So how do you respond? This is actually one of those questions I'm glad you're here because I've always wanted to ask you this one. How do you respond to you folks, even now you've got some of the conservative movement who say, we've cut taxes enough, we got to worry about spending, and until we worry about spending, we can't deal with taxes at all?
They have it backwards. If you leave the option of a tax increase on the table, you never get to spending. When we said to Obama, when he wanted to raise the debt ceiling by $2 trillion, Boehner, House leader, said, well, we'll give you the $2 trillion. You have to take $2 trillion out of spending over the next decade. So we'll match the $2 trillion debt ceiling you want, but we got to bring spending down. And the first thing they did was drop their planned spending by $1 trillion, money they hadn't yet spent, but they were planned to. And they took it out of the baseline, which made it very difficult to ever get back again. That was the easy trillion. The next trillion, they actually bent down spending. We went from 24% of national income consumed by the federal government to 20 because we just did this. And we won that spending fight only because we took taxes completely off the table, and Obama came back 100 zillion times saying, well, of course we're going to do taxes and spending cuts. And we said, no, okay, this is a pepperoni pizza. It's not pepperoni and shards of glass. Take your tax increase off. We're just doing spending. And we won that fight. Now, because we had the House and could say no, because the Democrats had the House this time, they drew some blood. There's a very tough spending bill that spends much too much money. I could have played this out in 100 times, and 50 of the times it would have been much worse, and maybe 50 of the times you could have done better. But what we got was what we got when we lost the House.
Right.
It's very expensive, bad.
So when we talk about taxes, people, national level, often talk about income tax. Local taxes, people talk about sales tax. But there's also the capital gains tax, and you mentioned this backstage, and I do want to talk to you a little bit about this because Warren Buffett likes to say that his secretary pays more than him because he pays capital gains tax, which is not actually him saying we should raise the capital gains tax rate. It's we should raise the income tax rate for everyone else and cut it for a secretary. And I'm a firm believer that the capital gains tax really does stimulate the economy if you can lower it. And it looks like there may be some progress on fixing the capital gains tax.
There is. As long as Nancy Pelosi controls the House, or AOC through Nancy Pelosi, nothing good will come from the House and Senate until after 2020. If we get the House back, then lots of things are possible. If we don't, then we're back to frozen. But there is something we can do through executive action alone. And that is to and the president says he wants to do this. He told Bloomberg he intended to do it. The vice president is on it. I've worked it for the last 2 years through everybody in the White House. There are no known predators. Everybody's in. We just have to get our legal ducks in line, and next 2 months this should happen. And that is to say we're no longer going to tax inflation when we tax capital gains. So, but if you've owned a house for a while, you know that a lot of the increase in the value of that house is inflation, not real. If you own stock for 20, 30, 40 years, there are even times when you're losing money, but you pay capital gains taxes on the inflation. It's a dramatic cut for older Americans on their capital gains taxes when you have your nest egg and you want to sell it, or your home and you want to move, or a farm, or a small business. This will dramatically increase people's retirement income and the wealth that they have, and actually raise revenue, because we'll see trillions of dollars change hands in the next 2 years of sticky capital, particularly corporations that own land that they've had for 50 years. To sell it costs a lot of money, so they don't. So they park cars on it instead of building a building, or selling it to somebody who wants to build a building. We will use capital much more efficiently, and then going forward, 20-year-olds who buy stock or a home or land know that they're not going to pay taxes on inflation in the future. Tremendous boost to the economy. The reason we can do this is in 2002, the Supreme Court ruled in an FCC, Federal Communications case, that they could change the definition of cost from historic cost, what'd you pay for it, to real cost, what'd you pay for it plus inflation, or even replacement cost. What's it cost to get another one? There are lots of different definitions of cost, and the Supreme Court said it's not unambiguous. If you go to a book on economics or business, there are many costs. What is it? And so as this moves forward, it's the one thing that could really jumpstart the economy. That and coming to an agreement with China so that the tariffs go away. That would give us 5,000 points on the Dow, but this will also be tremendously helpful. So there are two really good things that can happen on taxes. One is ending the tariff war, hopefully winning the tariff war, or at least, but getting the uncertainty gone, and fixing capital gains taxes so you don't tax inflation. I want to run against the Democrats screaming at people who own homes. More than half the people in the country own homes, more than half the people in the stock market, more than half the people have IRAs or 401ks, and they say 1% of people would benefit from lower capital gains taxes, that they're missing what the country looks like.
Right. It's actually really good policy. I'm glad to hear
Yes.
that. I'm kind of working my way through. Yesterday morning, Tim Scott was here. He was talking about one of the things that Republicans need to repackage and talk about more is when we talk about diversity and generational shifts and racial demographics between the parties, that there are a lot of poor African American and Hispanic families in this country that own land. Their families are farmers. And they don't connect Democratic tax policy with the estate tax to their parents who own the land are going to die, and they're going to have to give up the land to pay the taxes on the land that they don't even get a part of because they have to give up the land. And he was talking yesterday about how he thinks this is something Republicans need to seize on and advance. And we've talked about the estate tax a lot, but I do wonder if you think he might be right. We don't talk enough about the poor people who are farmers who own a lot of land, so on paper they've got a lot of value. In reality, they don't.
The Farm Bureau has endorsed indexing capital gains so you don't pay taxes on inflation. Actually, we got the Chamber of Commerce to endorse it last week. NFIB's in. Small businesses, people who own land, big beneficiaries. I agree with Senator Scott. I think the biggest thing, though, is to go to the African American community and immigrant communities and talk to them about anything. Best that we have policies that would make their lives better. School choice is wildly possible, both with Hispanic Americans and African Americans, until you put the word Republican on it. And then it gets less popular. The Democrats' argument on winning minority votes is not that they should hate us. It's that we hate them and therefore don't listen. When you show up and are pleasant and have ideas that would benefit somebody, if one-on-one you can walk through them, you ruin most of their sales pitch, they hate you. No, they don't. They came by the other day. They said hi. They were advertising on urban radio. They were at the local church. They were visiting with us. I talked to them. It blows away their central argument, which is we don't like them. And then you can be listened to. I think we should spend a lot more time both in person and frankly on radio. When we spend ads, it shouldn't just be in the districts where we think we're going to get votes today, but where we need to convince people over time. We're not trying to bite them. They know that the government, I mean, this is why the Baltimore thing is so true and so odd and so poorly played. The African American community are the first victims of a unionized, bureaucratized school system set up to make the teachers union, the bureaucrats happy, and not educate kids. And Democrats did that to them. Democrats did that to them. And Republicans who support school vouchers and school choice and education savings accounts, and parental choice and education, we have solutions that solve a major problem in their life for a crime the Democrats committed against them. Crime in the areas where the Democrats didn't take crime seriously for years and years and years. They've been greatly damaged by the modern Democratic Party. And we can fix that, but we do need to show up and say hi. We can't do it from...
Amen. It's been a long time since you and I had this conversation, but back in 2002, the 2004 era, the Republicans took over Georgia, and then in 2006, they kind of swept the full state, and in 2010, we get a great new Republican governor, but the first reaction in the first terms of both of these governors was, hey, we need to raise sales tax on cigarettes and alcohol and other things. And I'm always amazed by the number of times Republicans and legislatures who are anti-tax are willing the moment a Republican governor says, cigarettes and alcohol, they're bad, let's raise taxes on them, that even Republicans are willing to get on board with these things. And I'm noticing more and more that the sales tax on singling out certain products, Republicans are really good at saying, oh, I love to cut taxes, but these are bad, we should raise taxes on them.
The establishment left in the culture will demonize a product or an industry, and they're softening it up to tax it, okay? And so they say, you shouldn't drink liquor, we're going to raise taxes on it, and some people, well, I don't drink, so who cares? And of course, they raise that tax, and we're going to raise a tax on a sin tax. All sin taxes are based on the idea we're going to tax it, so there'll be less of that. Less gambling, less liquor, less cigarettes, and okay. And then they fund a whole program off of something that they explained to us at the beginning was going to go away because of the tax increase. So taxes on sin taxes, excise taxes on a product that you want, they admit they want less of, right? When they tax income, they don't admit that the purpose is to reduce the number of people working and how much they make. But on excise taxes, they go, yes, we're doing this so people smoke fewer cigarettes. And then 10 years from now, like this, I don't have the money, you hired everybody, they've all got pensions, you're going to come back and tax or an income tax. All sin taxes are placeholders for income taxes in the future. Sometimes too stupid. And so we just have to find them. You said this, challenge. A number of Republicans used to be Democrats.
Right.
Okay. They the church from time to time. Yes, and try this. So there is this challenge from states that flipped. And you see, the more recently they flipped, the bigger the challenge is of people who still are tax and spend Democrats at heart, but they may be culturally Republican, or they may just be Republican because if you run as a D, you might lose in this district now. So I think I'll switch. We need to work on gently bringing those guys along.
Well, and you know, to his credit, the new governor here in Georgia is the first of the 3 consecutive Republican governors who actually didn't have a D next to his name before he never had to switch parties, which is great. And you can tell the thinking. the institutional thinking between someone who never had to change the letter next to their name versus the one who did. Now, in the time remaining, I actually want to throw something at you that I don't want to say I'm ambushing you with you because I know you'll have some thoughts on it. I was shocked this week to watch the Democrats and to learn that Barack Obama was an arch conservative who was bad on a host of policy issues, including taxation and spending issues, in addition to the border. And I would really like to get your thoughts on, did you know that you and Barack Obama were allies on a host of issues?
Yeah, well, he wasn't a big fan of,
Yeah, I
of our
remember
work,
this.
when he was trying to raise taxes.
He singled you out before he singled the NRA out.
Yeah, well, because we stopped, okay, we didn't stop him from getting what he wanted. The American people stopped him from getting what he wanted. What the Taxpayer Protection Pledge is, it makes it easy for an elected official to communicate with you, I will not raise your taxes. And you want to know why? It's written down. It's 2 witnesses, not that we don't trust them. It's dated. It's up on the web. We make many copies for everybody. And there's a wonderful study out of Washington University. If politicians who say they won't raise taxes, has no effect on whether they'll raise taxes. Put it in writing, big effect. And for some reason, they get the joke. I think it may be when George Herbert Walker Bush, kicked Iraq out of Kuwait without getting stuck occupying the place for a generation. He collapsed the Soviet Union without a lot of blood on the floor and got the Soviet Union to 15 pieces and to leave Eastern Europe. And then he raised taxes and he lost the election. This is a guy with monumental successes, and the only thing is, on his tombstone, raised taxes, said he wouldn't, liar. And every Republican goes, I got it. Because Bush had won that election because in the primary against Dole, he said, I've taken the pledge, you haven't, 2 days before the New Hampshire primary, which Dole was supposed to win, but didn't. And then he was 14 points behind Dukakis, the short guy in the tank from Massachusetts. And he was 14 points behind Dukakis. Then he said, read my lips, no new taxes. I'm Ronald Reagan. I'm not going to raise your taxes. He wins by 8 points. Then he turns around, governs, and raises taxes and loses. So the modern Republican candidate said, I get it. Take the pledge not to raise taxes, publicly and in writing, win the primary. Take the pledge publicly and in writing, win the general. Keep the pledge, get reelected. And so no one's life is a complete waste. Some people serve as bad examples. And there's been this, it was a painful loss. He would have been a much better second-term president than the guy he lost to. But we have to teach elected officials, don't lie your way into office. You have to be straight with the American people and don't raise taxes. And that's been a big, big help for everything else we've done. It's been more easy to do because we take taxes off the table. Now how do you solve things without a tax increase? What Obama had was, we took the House, then we took the Senate. He wasn't president for 8 years. He was president for 2 years. And then after that, he was the guy who lived in the White House and couldn't do anything unless the Republicans in the House agreed to it, and the more than 40, back when the filibuster was quite robust, could let him do in the Senate. And then eventually we took the Senate in 2014 as well. So what the Ds are attacking Obama for is all the things that the Republicans took away from him. He didn't do any of those things. He didn't want to do any of those things. He didn't want to sequester. He didn't want spending limits. He didn't want to make a number of the reforms or even deal with the border security or a lot of these issues. But the Republicans forced him. We didn't get as much as we wanted. I mean, I was over in the Republican foxhole, and they're going, we're not getting everything. I go, the president has the veto. You're not going to get everything. But do you understand the guys over there are bleeding from all pores because of what you are collecting and taking off the table from them? So it's just the reverse of that, where the Ds are looking at the Obama years and crediting him with our successes and acting as if he wanted to do that, which, if you have any idea what Obama really wanted to do compared to what he got, I ran into John Kerry, a Massachusetts senator before he was Secretary of State. He said, Grover, you know, your wife and my wife should really get together and have tea. Yes, they should, Senator. What would you like? What do you want? And he said, well, I'm hoping you could convince the Republicans. We're so close. Well, what is it that you're looking for? Well, what we need is a $1.4 trillion tax increase. And I said, I thought we had a $1.2 trillion problem. Well, yes, but the president wants another $400 billion in additional spending in our deficit reduction package. So we're going to have to raise taxes even more. And I assured him I'd do what I could. And, but for Obama, what he thought he was going to get out of that negotiation, we were off by $1.4 trillion. So he spent the rest of his presidency trying to get that $1.4 trillion back, which he thinks he was cheated out of. Let me assure the nice Democrats, he was doing everything you'd want him to do. He fought valiantly. He was trying to loot the American people. He was trying to regulate everything. He was trying to raise taxes and spending, and we just beat him, okay? We didn't win everything, but we beat him on so much of what we wanted. So they should not be mad at him. They should be mad at the Republican majority in the House and the 40-plus votes in the Senate.
It is kind of funny, though, how they're so quick to turn on their own. Now, let me ask you, in the last couple of minutes we have up here, what should conservative activists be on the lookout for coming up in the next couple of years? Is there anything on the horizon that concerns you or excites you?
Yeah. If we get the House, Senate, and presidency again, we'll take the corporate rate down again. That has been monumentally successful in bringing capital and jobs and work to the United States. We'll take the small business subchapter S, pass through the 20% exclusion, the cut in business taxes for the 10 million plus self-employed folks. We'll take that down again, and we'll take individual rates down again. So that's kind of baked in. If we win, that's what we'll do, and that's generally good. There are a couple little things. We double tax Americans who work overseas. That's not helpful. We should get rid of that. That's vaguely complicated, but on the list of things to do. On dangers, the energy tax, the carbon tax, the tax on carbon dioxide, the other team keeps coming back at that, and they ask the question in a jillion different ways. It's like a teenage boy on a prom date. They keep asking the same thing in different ways. And and the trick is to say no, no, no. It does, you just have to keep, no, no, yes does not solve your problem. And they want the energy tax because they know there is no more blood out of the turnip of the income tax. They will have higher taxes on people who earn more money because they don't like them and they want to signal they don't like them. But even Obama admitted that higher capital gains taxes lose revenue, and he was still for it. Still for it, even, this is in conversation, even though he knew intellectually that every time we've raised capital gains taxes, the government gets less money. This is just to punish people who do that sort of thing, like make money, and express your contempt for them. To get money to turn us into a social democracy like European countries, France, they want to get a consumption tax, a value-added tax, in addition to the income tax and the corporate income tax. Until you get that, we will always be 20% more free than the Europeans. If you get a energy tax, the green energy tax, carbon pricing tax, is a VAT on training wheels. It is practice for a VAT on everything. It's just a VAT on energy. And then the energy companies will be the #1 cheerleaders for, let's make everybody else pay this tax, not just us. Instead of 7 on us, how about 5 on everybody? And they'll pay for the campaign to move it off them. So the answer is, if we get that, we do, I think, grind eventually towards European levels of large government. And that's awfully tough to take off the table. Japan, when they put the VAT in, started a decline that's continued. We need to make sure we ever get a value-added tax. It's a French word for big government. Have a tax, which will turn into a hidden tax. Be mad at the power company, even though it's the taxes that are driving it up. Threat. Then it's the tax vape, tax this, tax technologies. The Europeans want to tax all of our very successful data companies because they see all this stuff going on. Well, where's our VIG?
Right.
How come we're not getting a piece of the action here? And the Americans are doing all this. It's actually just, I mean, it's an assault on the American economy. It's not just a tax. That we have to fight at the government level, but we need to make sure our government does not impose under any circumstance. Here's the sales pitch they're going to give you. It's like the third to the last scene in The Godfather where they explain, here's how they're going to come at you, here's the deal they're going to offer you, then they're going to kill you. Don't do it. They will come and say, let's have a carbon tax and take it all and reduce the corporate tax. Well, guess what? We did reduce the corporate tax without a carbon tax, but that's what they were selling for years to the business community, which was open to the suggestion. Well, let's have a carbon tax and we'll write everybody in the country a check. So the government doesn't make any money, we just make everybody dependent on the government. And then later we come back and take that away. There are people peddling this now. There's actually one Republican in the House, Francis Rooney from Naples. He was an old oil guy and he hates coal people, literally. I talked to him about, why are you doing this stupid thing? You seem so nice. And I hate coal people. I just hate coal people. Okay. You live in Florida. They don't even have coal. Anyway. So they have one Republican congressman. They've had others. They all got beat. But not more than 2 or 3. So on our side, we're holding pretty solidly. We did a letter, Americans for Tax Reform, got about 80, 90 center-right groups. Everybody in the world signed on. You joined us. On, we all say no energy tax on for any reason, for any swap, regardless of, how they pretty it up. No. And there were 2 center-right groups that are on the take that didn't sign, but everybody else did. So we really have a united Republican Party, a united front, no to this, but that does not mean they will not come back again and again and again and again. Remember the land shark thing? Right. For Saturday Night, land shark, they keep knocking on the door. They keep coming back and telling you they're something other than the land shark.
Grover Norquist, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you. I enjoyed that tremendously.
Good. Thanks so much.
Thank you. David Perdue is going to be down there when you all call. Senator Perdue.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Sure. Isn't he terrific? Now you know what to keep in mind. Okay, so my next guest. Yeah, I mean, he deserves it. How do I even do an introduction here for him? For those of you who aren't from Georgia, you still benefit by having his wit and wisdom in the United States Senate. For those of us who are in Georgia, he's ours. He's a great senator. The senator from Georgia, Senator David Perdue. Thank you for coming.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
So first, I got to ask, how's your wife?
She's great. She told me to ask how you are.
Good. I mean, I'm a little biased. She's my favorite Perdue, but.
Well, that's easy. Mine too.
So, you heard Grover and me. We were just talking about taxation and tax reform, and you guys were able to do some great tax reform in Washington that has really stimulated the economy. And given your business background, I wanted to start first with the economy because we saw the Fed the other day lower rates for the first time in a while, generated some headlines. Markets are a little bit nervous about the president's tariff stuff. How do you see the lay of the land economically right now?
Well, first of all, Eric, I'd like to welcome all of you not from Georgia to Georgia, the best state in the country in which to do business.
There are some Texans who you better watch out.
We have the best economic turnaround. I call it a turnaround, not a renaissance or anything else. This is a turnaround. We were headed in the wrong direction. In my estimate, and I've looked at this is the best economic turnaround in U.S. history. I was in the White House 2 weeks after President Trump was inaugurated, and his mission there was to talk about what our agenda would be the first 2 years. And he said, look, job one is to grow the economy. And so we said, what are we going to do then? We agreed that we would work on regulation, energy, taxes, and Dodd-Frank. And we knocked all of those out of the park, frankly. And because of that, consumer confidence went up, CEO confidence went up, capital formation really took off after a decade of sitting on its backside, if you will. And we really did kickstart this economy. So we produced 6 million new jobs in the last 2 years. We have the lowest unemployment in 50 years, the lowest African American, Asian, and Hispanic unemployment ever measured. We have the highest middle class income right now. And yet, when I hear Democrats talk about, well, this is all due to the Obama fiscal policy,
Right.
I go bananas. Just tee that one up and then wait 4 hours. I'll be through talking about 4 hours later. I just love for a Democrat to try to tell me that they're the fiscally responsible group and that they got this thing started. They were doing everything they could to kill the economy.
Well, in that regard, on the fiscal responsibility, I know you guys are having to deal with a very tough budget issue.
Yep.
We're going to have potentially $1 trillion deficit. The debt keeps going up.
Yep.
It doesn't seem like there's any movement to deal with this, and the Democrats are stuck on raise taxes, raise taxes.
Yep.
Is there anything that on the executive side can do? Is there anything to start dealing with this issue?
Yeah, let me put it in perspective. You know, we have $22 trillion of debt. Over the next 30 years, we have $130 trillion of liabilities already committed to by career politicians over the last 50 years. Now, put that in perspective, that's $1 million per household in America. This is why I ran. I'd never run for anything. This is why I ran for the United States Senate. And growing the economy is one of 5 things you can do to address that. But the 800-pound gorilla I'll get to in a minute, but there are 5 things you have to do. President Trump understands this. When he was running, I asked him about the debt and would he be focused on that? He said, absolutely. We've got to do some things first. We have to get the confidence of the country back. Remember where we were. We had a president telling us that 2% is a new norm in terms of economic growth. Oh, we're just going to be another member of the community of nations. We won't be the shining city on the hill anymore. We're not going to be the colonialist country that his father described us as. We're going to be just another member. So in comes Trump, and what we are doing now is working on 5 things, 3 of which are already underway to deal with a long-term debt crisis. One is grow the economy. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, says if you grow the economy 100 basis points more than you did under Obama, and we're more than doing that right now, you lower the debt curve by $3 trillion over a decade. Now that's fine, but that's only about 1/3 of the problem. So you can't grow your way out of here. And contrary to what the Democrats say, you can't tax your way out of here. The second thing we have to do is we have to fix this budget process, and some of you have heard me talk about this. I'm sorry, this is about the stage where my wife says that I can bring any cocktail party to its knees talking about this. But the second thing is you have to fix this broken budget process. In '74, Congress has only funded the government on time 4 times. Imagine if you were to do that and went to your banker and said everything is fine 4 times. The only reason we can do that is because we're the reserve currency and we can still borrow money. The third thing you have to do is get rid of redundant agencies. We now have the first, thanks to Donald Trump, we have the first ever DOD audit. Department of Defense has now, for the first time, even though in '91 Congress passed a law that said a president was supposed to supply to Congress an audit of the Defense Department, the 3rd largest line item on the sheet, nobody had ever done it. So I went to President Trump and said, do you realize we have a law? He said, well, why don't we have an audit? And I said, well, they say it's too large, too expensive, too complicated. And I reminded them it's only a little bit, DOD's only a little bit larger than Walmart. Can you imagine if Walmart called Congress and said, oh, I'm not going to give you the numbers this quarter? So it's just nonsense. So he said, well, yeah, we're going to have an audit. 1 year later to the day almost, we have our first audit. The fourth thing you have to do, and thank you. Look, I can't defend all of his tweets, but I'll tell you this man is driving for results, and that's where I came from. And most of you live in that world right now, in the real world. The fourth thing we have to do, and this is the biggest one, Eric, and you've talked about this all the time, I do too, and that is if you don't save Social Security and Medicare, this thing just gets unwound around our ears. It really does. And the last thing is medical costs. We've wasted a decade talking about insurance and not the real drivers of healthcare costs. So 3 of those 5 things we're already working on to try to get this curve down. Now the lie of the decade, maybe the century, is the Democrats say, yeah, but the Republicans don't care about the debt. I'm the biggest debt hawk in Congress that I can see, and I'm the only one that I know of that has a debt clock in my office. I watch this thing spin every day to make myself, remind myself of how fast this is going. It's like $100,000 a second, y'all. I mean, this thing is outrageous. But it reminds me of the focus that we've got to have on doing this. And the lie of the Democrats said, well, this tax bill raised spending $1.7 trillion. Well, Congressional Budget Office said that, but they also said 2 other things. They said if you grow the economy 0.4% more, it more than pays for it. Well, guess what? We're way over that. And then it said if you increase growth by 100 basis points, just 1 percentage point, it lowers the debt curve $3 trillion over a decade. And that's All three of those things are true, but they never tell you the last two. So this is the number one threat to our national security, our economic wherewithal, and the future of our kids and our kids' kids going forward is the debt problem.
You mentioned medical costs. It is constantly fascinating to me, and I mentioned this yesterday, that it was progressives who were attacking some of the Democrats on stage this past week, saying you keep bashing insurance companies and they're only maximum 5% of the costs dealing with medical. And I actually had no idea, because they talk about it so much, I assumed it was much higher than that. I mean, the overall medical costs in this country, so it's not the insurance companies, it's the other issues. And meanwhile, they want to blow up pharmaceutical companies and everything else.
Well, they've already blown up the insurance industries. I mean, that's for sure. We wasted a decade because of Obamacare. But you mentioned a word I want to rail against just a second. Progressives.
Yeah.
Sounds like a really good word, doesn't it? Oh, I'm progressive. I'm thinking ahead of you. I have a new way of thinking.
They can't use liberal anymore.
No, it's not liberal. It's progressive. But let me tell you a little history on that. Where did that word come from? In the first decade of the 19th century is where that word came from, when they said, oh, our abundance is all fulfilling. I mean, we're the most affluent country in the history of the world. We've got all this we can do. We're going to have a new way of thinking. The government's going to come in and take charge, and everything's going to be fine. In 1913, they changed the Senate from being appointed by the state houses to be elected. I personally agreed with that, by the way, because I'd have never been appointed by a state legislature to be in the United States Senate. It took you all to get me here, so thank you. But over the last 100 years, Eric, the progressives have been the dominant leaders in thought and in politics. The Democrats have had 4 political supermajorities in that 100 years. 4. Guess how many Republicans have had? 0. We've been the minority party because we play defense. We're defensive on our conservative values. But right now, we've got a president that's fighting for us. We have told the world what we believe in. We've actually executed most of it. And now we have the results to prove it. And yet we're still bashful about it. And I'm here to tell you that those 4 Democratic supermajorities gave us the New Deal, the Great Society, Dodd-Frank, and Obamacare. And I'm just a business guy, but I can put at the feet of those supermajorities and those big sweeping bills that brought us bigger government, most of the responsibility for this $22 trillion calamity we have right now. And the irony of all that is they failed the people they claim to champion. Democrats say all the time, well, we're the champion of the little guy, the working men and women of America. Nonsense. They believe in one thing, democratic power. That's what this is all about. Now they're talking about, oh, we want a single party government. We want a socialist agenda. We're so affluent, we want to share it with the world, and they have no idea what built this economic miracle. I'm telling you, innovation, capital formation, and the rule of law, and on the back of the best workforce in the history of the world, created this economic miracle in the last 75 years. And it angers me that these people are so superior and so egalitarianism, I guess, that they believe that we can now tinker with the fundamentals that created this economic miracle, democracy and capitalism.
I had a great question, but I lost it when you said that, so I got to move into a different area.
Well, I'm sorry. I mean, I get emotional. I mean, why do
point.
this if you're not going to be passionate, right? Why are you here?
Right.
This is the future of our country. Eric, thank you so much for doing this. And Eric and I have always been on the same plane on these issues. I mean, this is not about whether he and I might disagree on this or that. It's who are we standing up against. We're not fighting each other. This is the fight of our generation, folks. I mean, I can't say it any stronger. He says it in his editorials. When he goes on Rush's program, he says it. This is about the future for our children and our children's children, which is exactly what Reagan warned us about when he said that freedom is only one generation away from extinction, you know?
I remember what I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned it in that, and it sounds very wonky, but I know the president and you in particular and the Congress, when the Republicans had both houses, worked to curb Dodd-Frank, which I view as a piece of legislation that helped chase a ton of capital to Europe and out of the United States
absolutely.
through onerous regulation. And I know it goes over a lot of people's heads, but first, thank you for your leadership on that. And two, if you could talk about how some of these policies that have been put in place by the Obama administration that are being rolled back really did chase capital to other countries.
Oh, what happened under President Obama is that they really wanted the central government to control capital. If you can control capital and then insurance and then education, guess what? Who's in control? The government. The founders, the mothers and fathers that we had 230 years ago, that's what they were running away from. And that's what they built all these rules to protect against. And so, you know, what I see going on right now is that Obama had pulled back, he had caused $6 trillion to go on the sidelines of capital. There was $2 trillion on the Russell 1000 balance sheets. These are the largest companies because of overregulation and uncertainty coming out of Washington. The second thing is they had $2 trillion on the balance sheets of community banks and small regional banks because of Dodd-Frank, as you just mentioned. And then we had this crazy repatriation law that we hadn't gotten rid of, and there was some $3 trillion plus overseas in unrepatriated U.S. property. That's $6 trillion of equity that was not working in the $20 trillion economy. Well, that's nuts. So what President Trump did, being a business guy wanting to get results, is we removed the uncertainty. I think now it's over 2,000 regulations have been reversed. You know, we passed that tax bill that freed up the money to come back from overseas. CBO says last year alone we brought back $1 trillion in prior in unrepatriated U.S. profits. And I think the biggest thing that we did, believe it or not, as part of this tax bill, was or part of the overall plan that we had in addition to the tax bill, was in a bipartisan way with Republican leadership, we, I think, repealed the most onerous parts of Dodd-Frank. Small community banks had nothing to do with the 08 and 09 financial crisis. They just didn't. They didn't deal in things that caused that crisis. And yet Dodd-Frank just crushed them because they had to have capital reserves in excess of what they really needed. They couldn't do some things they needed to do. So we repealed that and freed that back. If you go to small towns right now, my hometown, right here 2 hours south of here, and look at what the local banks are doing. They're back in the home mortgage business, they're back in the car lending business, and they're making money again. So I think in reestablishing the economic wherewithal in local communities, that had as much to do with the turnaround as anything I can see.
I want to shift actually to those local communities. I know you'll be on the ballot in 2020, and everyone always wants to talk about national politics, but let's talk about you as a senator for Georgia, and what do you see as your big issues for Georgia?
Well, agriculture is over half of our economy. We've got two great infrastructure things here in Georgia. We have the Atlanta-Hartsville Airport right now, the busiest airport in the world, and we have the Savannah Port, the fourth largest port in the world, in the country, the fastest growing port, the only one that exports more than imports. So we've got the fundamentals. And truly, this is the 6th year in a row Georgia's been established as rated the best place in the country to do business. That didn't happen by accident.
Take that, Texas.
Yeah, we didn't. Yeah. Now, you said that, not me. I lived in Texas, y'all. I have to be a little careful with that. But no, seriously, I think that there are some limiters right now to Georgia, and that is labor and infrastructure. And that's true of the country. Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister of Singapore, said in growing an economy, and he's the architect of the China resurgence. He really is. He said there are 4 simple things that you have to have. One is you have to have clean, potable water. Singapore has none. They had to bring it in from Malaysia. We have a problem with that in Georgia right now. Texas has somewhat of a problem with that. Colorado, others have. 13 states really have water problems right now, but Georgia has a little bit of a problem there. Second, you have to have cheap power. Georgia has the cheapest power in the country. The third, you have to have an educated and trained workforce, and that's one of our problems right now. The fourth is you have to have world-class infrastructure. So the limiters right now in Georgia are labor for our ag communities, our construction. We're growing like crazy here in Georgia. Welcome, come on down, or come back to see us, as they used to say. But I am absolutely convinced this is going to continue because we've got the right political leadership in the state that understands capital formation, the rule of law, how to breed innovation. Atlanta's becoming a hub for technology innovation too, which is a very exciting part of our growth.
So what's your relationship like with Governor Abrams? I mean, Governor Kemp.
Well, before you said Kemp, my answer would have been who? I come from a world like you do. You have to kind of earn your way up. Mm-hmm. It's fine to aspire to things, but you kind of have to work your way there.
Kind of got to win an election.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Business, the art community, medicine, sports, the military. I mean, how many idiot 4-star generals do you ever see, really? I mean, these people have proven that they can get there. You all live in the real world. To get to where you are, you have to produce. And so it's kind of ironic. I think we've got a great governor. We had a wake-up call in this race, in the governor's race. The Democrats rolled out a new model in Texas and in Georgia Karl Rove is standing up against that in Texas and helping in John Cornyn's race right now. But that Ted Cruz race was a lot closer than it should have been, and Brian Kemp's race was a lot closer than it should have been. But they rolled out in Georgia 800 paid employees on the ground. That's never been done before. And so they made it less about the candidate and less about the issues and more about the physical ability to go out and register new voters and harvest those new voters.
To some degree, I think for 2020, I realize it's still a ways away, but maybe I shouldn't be shocked, but I think the Democrats might have taken some of the wrong lessons from 2018 in Georgia, where they've decided they're just going to run to the left. And there is this real mad dash right now among the Democrats in the race against you to be as far left as possible. You have the moderate former mayor of Columbus, Georgia, who now wants everybody to know she's more progressive than the guy who literally grew a resistance beard. I didn't even know that was such a thing. And they're out there scrambling, and you seem to be getting results while they just seem to be getting enraged.
Well, they can't argue the issues. And first of all, it really doesn't matter who they decide will be their second-tier candidate, if you will. It really doesn't matter, because they're going to make it less about the issues and less about the candidate and more about their ability to go get the votes. But they misread 2018 in a big way. And I think this applies to President Trump's race in 2020 as well. When you're electing an incumbent, I think most people, common sense people, forget about whether they're in a Democratic Party, Republican Party, whatever. They kind of look at the person in the office and say, did they do what they said they were going to do? President Trump checks every box. And the thing that I'm proud of is that he does. I mean, he checks every box. Look, I can tell you, he drives for results. He calls me late at night, early in the morning. I mean, I don't know when the man sleeps, y'all. I mean, really. But he wants results. And you can see it in some of the compromises that he does. Look, he's pushed us. He's stretched us in the last 2 years. But look at the results he's getting. He's called out and stood up to NATO, and called out that our allies are not paying their fair share. Well, how many presidents have stood up to China in the last 40 years, for goodness sake? How many have delivered a new USMCA? I mean, I can do this all day. So I think the political landscape for 2020 is going to be very interesting. The Democrats have decided that they believe what Hillary Clinton said when she lost in 2016. She said, I lost because I didn't go far enough left. But let's remember, they believe that we need a single-party government. They believe we need bigger central government. They want a social democracy, but it's even more than that. You can look at this socialized medicine plan they have, combine that with the Green New Deal. There is physically no way you can pay for both of those together. There's physically no way. Let me give you an example. The Green New Deal is $9 trillion, best estimate I can find per year. Per year, $9 trillion. To put that in perspective, we only collect $2 trillion in income tax. So we collect the Green New Deal would be $9 trillion. The adjusted gross income of America, all in, total, is $9 trillion. Every dime of earned salary and income that we have as America would go to the, quote, Green New Deal. I mean, it's outrageous. They don't even think about what they're saying. Now they're manufacturing candidates like Cortez and others that didn't come through the crucible of performance and that performance pyramid I talk about. And now they think they can do it with arbitrary mechanisms such as harvesting votes and registering illegals. They want illegals to vote. They want felons to vote. And there's no surprise why, right? Because they think they can become the dominant party and move to a one-party system. You just have to read what they say. I think, Patton got it right. I read your book. You remember that quote, right? You have to listen to what they're saying. And what they're saying is Kamala Harris wants to do away with the Electoral College. Schumer wants Puerto Rico, and I heard this argument the other day on the floor of the Senate. He wants D.C. and Puerto Rico to become 2 new states. They want more seats on the Supreme Court. I don't think they'll find a balanced person like Gorsuch or Kavanaugh. They're going to load it up with their side, right? So these are very strong indications that what they want is a single-party system that we know failed in Russia in 1917, Germany in 1933, Cuba in 1959, and Venezuela later in the 20th century. We know all these things they're trying to perpetrate right now have failed. Why are they doing it? Because they can promise something to the electorate, get elected, move to a single-party system, and then the future of America is really in doubt.
Last question for you here is, we've been asking the crowd, they can submit questions. One I really want to ask you about, and I know you touched on a little bit earlier, is a lady named Brenda who lives in Savannah. Wanted to just, one, thank you for your support of the port, and two, see if you could explain a little more the national importance of what the Savannah port means and where we're going to go from there with it.
Well, having been on that port authority back when I was in business, I'm intimate with the power of that port. But we tried for 20 years to deepen that port 5 feet. I'm sorry, I always do this. 5 feet. 20 years we tried to get permission to deepen the port 5 feet to handle these large post-Panamax ships that would lower shipping costs by over 50% in many cases. This port right here reaches something like 80% of America's consumptive power better than any other port in the country. That's true. It also has the best productivity of any port in the country. It's the fastest growing port for that reason. They're going to double their container traffic in the next 5 years. Now listen to this, with no state, no federal money, from cash flow.
Wow, I did not know that. I had no idea.
It's a powerful asset that America has, and it's a model for other ports, and there are other ports doing that too. And President Trump gets the credit because he broke that logjam 2 years ago when I presented to him when he talked about infrastructure. In the second year, we were supposed to talk about immigration, trade, and infrastructure, and that's what we've been doing. And I gave him a clue that he already had some key projects in America that all we had to do was just do the funding. So for the third year in a row, President Trump has made sure that the Port of Savannah got funded, and oh, by the way, now is looking at completion. And I can't tell you what that will do for the economy, not only of Georgia, but of the entire eastern side of the United States.
Senator, I honestly could sit here all day with you. Don't have the time, and thank you for being generous with your time.
No, it's a
Thank
delight
you
to be
so
here.
much. Anything we can do to help you in 2020, let us know.
It's great to see you, buddy.
Thank you so much. Tell your wife I said hi.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Senator, Congressman Roy will be at the end of the steps.
Thank you.
I really could spend all day talking to Senator Perdue. He's a fascinating guy. His election is in 2020. You don't have to be from Georgia to donate. Now, the next speaker is a longtime friend of mine. He and his wife and his children have been strong prayer warriors for my wife. I have known him for years, and he's also my accountability partner. If I dare say anything that even has a hint of being wobbly, he immediately texts me and chastises me for potentially going wobbly or squishy on an issue. He is one of you heard Congressman Meadows yesterday say he's the intellectual force behind the House Freedom Caucus these days, has never looked at a fight and didn't try to figure out a way to win it. He is committed to smaller government. He's long been committed to smaller government. The Democrats are targeting him in 2020. They're using, you've probably heard of Wendy Davis. She's going to be running against him. Yeah, in Texas. His district stretches from Austin to San Antonio, and his just influence within the House Freedom Caucus and growing within Congress as a freshman member of Congress is growing as well. It is just a delight to bring up my friend, the congressman from Texas, Chip Roy. Hey, man.
Good to see you.
You too. So, first, how was the Braves game you went to without taking me to last night?
Well, unfortunately for Atlanta, obviously the Reds came out on top, but my son Charlie, who loves baseball, was just happy to be there, and it's my third Brave Stadium to go to in my life. That's how old I am now, right? I age myself by Brave Stadium, so yeah.
So let's talk about first, you getting into Congress. Yesterday, I don't think you'd gotten in yet, Congressman Meadows was up here singing your praises.
I saw him. He said some trash talk about Texas.
He did trash talk Texas. And he wasn't even guarded about it. But he was singing your praises, coming into the House of Representatives, having worked in Congress for a while for members of Congress, now being a congressman, knowing the rules, being able to navigate it. There really is something to being able to navigate your way through, having been up there with some knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it helps a little bit. I certainly have people I can rely upon, but more importantly, I know how broken the place is. Eric knows I work closely with Governor Rick Perry to help him write his book, Fed Up. In the first chapter of that book, which we wrote in 2010, unbelievably 9 years ago, it was titled, America is Great, Washington is Broken. That remains true today. And we've got a fundamental disconnect between Washington, D.C. and the people those of you in this room and others who make this country great, who understand what our founding principles mean for you and your lives and your children. And so going into Washington knowing that, knowing what the swamp actually is, right? The president has rightly coined that term, so you have something to target. But we've been fighting the swamp for a long time. We know how that works. We saw it on full display this week when John Ratcliffe, a good man, was nominated for DNI, and he's getting trashed by Democrats. And where was Mitch McConnell and Richard Burr, with all due respect? They were MIA. They were leaving John Ratcliffe, my friend from Texas, to dangle in the wind. That's the swamp, right? $320 billion over the caps last year. Republicans voted for it in the Senate, a majority. That's the swamp. If you know that, you know how to fight it, you know how to try to take it down. And we ended up getting 2/3 of House Republicans to vote against that spending bill last week because you know how to go attack that very nature of the swamp.
Well, it's one of the singular frustrations I have right now, and you and I, we talk about this almost every week, that there are a lot of Republicans in Washington who say they want to cut the size and scope of the federal government, but there seem to be very few of them who actually try to cut the size and scope of federal government.
No, I mean, look, the spending issue to me is, it's hard to pick a number one issue. In Texas, for me, immigration is something, we'll probably talk about border security in a minute. But spending is proxy for government getting big and taking over your lives and interfering with your ability to prosper. That's the real problem with spending, right? The debt is concerning from a fiscal and economic standpoint, but it is the proxy of the government getting so big that it's interfering with your lives. Let's think about this for a minute. Ronald Reagan in 1964 in his Time for Choosing speech, he lamented $17 million, that's with an M, of annual deficit spending. In today's dollars, that is approximately $140 million with an M dollars in annual deficit spending. He gave a big speech about it, right? A rip-roaring speech. They're dealing with nominating Goldwater in '64. How much are we racking up today? $100 million of debt per hour. Per hour. Now, if you don't believe me, I actually said that, and I got PolitiFact checked on it, and they gave me a mostly true. That's like the Gospel of Luke from PolitiFact, so you can just take that to the bank. So that's what we're dealing with, right? But
So it would have been absolutely true if you'd actually said it wasn't Barack Obama's fault. PolitiFact would have said, yeah, absolutely,
exactly.
yeah.
But you know, look, that's what we're facing. And so what happens? In Washington, everybody just starts going to their corners and saying, well, we've got to spend more money. Oh, don't worry about it. It's just a mandatory spending problem, right? It's just entitlements. That's an excuse. We still have 1/3 of our budget that you got to go deal with, and we had an opportunity just last week to try to put any kind of brakes and fiscal responsibility in place. And instead, you had a majority of Republicans in the Senate, thankfully only about 1/3 of House Republicans, who voted for this thing, but it's $320 billion over the caps. If you stick to the caps, our deficits are still $1 trillion. That's what you're talking about. And so, yes, we need to deal with mandatory spending, but it is a creature of Washington habit that they spend. It was like when Tom Coburn coined the term gateway spending drug with earmarks, right? These guys, they get drunk with power in terms of spending dollars, and it's other people's money, so they've never met a dollar they can't spend in the name of national defense. And that's the last point. I keep hearing from a lot of Republicans, in good faith, I believe, that we need to keep spending this money in order to give our men and women the tools they need. You know what? I represent Fort Sam Houston, the Army Futures Command, and about 90,000 veterans. Not one of them have come to me and said, please mortgage the future of our country on the backs of the military. Not one of them. Not one of them have come to me and said, I want my children and grandchildren to be unable to defend this nation because we've spent it into oblivion. And that's where we're headed. Interest on the national debt will eclipse defense spending in 2024, even if interest rates stay as low as they are right now. We have got to tackle this problem today.
I want to move into defense, but in getting there, I want to get to the border because I know you, Jody Heiss, and others have, you in particular, because of the nature of your district, you've been to the border a lot. And if you wouldn't mind, just talk to us about what you see down there, what you encounter.
So I'm pulling out my phone for a reason. I have spent a decent amount of time on the border. The southwestern edge of the district I represent, Texas 21, is about 100 miles from Laredo, from the border of Texas and Mexico. What we are seeing there is completely unprecedented. If you are not from Texas or if you are not from Arizona or New Mexico, then you're not feeling what's actually happening. It is 10 times worse, 100 times worse than you can possibly imagine. Our Border Patrol agents are under siege. As we speak, right now, they are under siege. Cartels, particularly the Gulf Cartel, the Reynosa faction, the Cartel del Noreste of Los Zetas, and the Sinaloas have operational control of the border of Texas and Mexico. Full operational control. They decide who comes across. They choose. They are making hundreds of millions of dollars moving people, not narcotics. They make money moving narcotics. They're making hundreds of millions of dollars. One study said $2 billion in 2017 that cartels made moving people across our southern border. It is a profit model. It is a human smuggling business. They have a business model, and they're operating it every single day. While Democrats attack our law enforcement officers, Border Patrol and ICE, and they do so with complete reckless abandon for the sovereignty of the United States, the well-being of the citizens of the United States, and the very migrants that they say that they're trying to help in the false name of compassion, while little girls get abused on the journey through Mexico, while cartels are overrunning our southern communities. I got an email just 10 minutes ago from a guy at Border Patrol who's on the front lines right now. He's an Army veteran, I think Army, he's a veteran. And he says, sir, he said 250 plus apprehensions just this morning. This is in one small sector. Unknown gotaways meaning people that they couldn't track down. No manpower, getting destroyed. All morning, 1079s. I wrote back, what are 1079s? He says, those means no unit available. DPS, that's Texas, Department of Public Safety, just caught 18 on Highway 83 with an Indian national. When our ground sensors go off, when a drawbridge camera sends an image, or even when our aerostats view a group in real time, we don't have enough agents to respond or apprehend, so we call those 1079s. And he sent images. There's images after images of individuals crossing our border. That's happening while we're sitting here. So while we're sitting here and I'm having this conversation with Eric, we're going to rack up another $50 million of debt for your children and grandchildren, and hundreds of people are pouring across your border. That's what's happening with your Washington leadership today, with their head in the sand, abandoning the field for our law enforcement on the front lines on the border. If you can tell that I'm frustrated about it, just even start to have this conversation with me and those who actually know what's happening on the southern border.
Well, in that regard, this is something we have had several conversations about. The president, back in December and January, went through the fight with Congress, shut down the government, trying to get money.
Right.
Didn't have a lot of Republicans even willing to back him up in the Congress on this, and was saying this is a crisis. We've got to do something. The New York Times editorial page came out and said, it is a crisis. Give the president what he wants. Tom Friedman wrote an article, it is a crisis. Give him what he wants. And the Democrats all said, it's not a crisis, it's not a crisis, it's not a crisis. Now suddenly it's a crisis for them, but it's only a crisis in terms of how the children are being handled in detainment facilities. They're being handled in the exact same way Barack Obama handled them. They were okay with it. I realize that it's politics, but it's also people's lives. It's also our border. It's also something that's been going on for a very long time that no one cared about until President Trump got elected.
Well, I think that's right, and it's getting exponentially worse as we speak, which is really the problem. And if you think about what we dealt with, so I've been in Congress now for just over 7 months, or right at 7 months, almost exactly. In fact, I think 7 months, today. And during that time, as Eric pointed out, we've had Democrats go from there's no crisis to manufactured crisis. I mean, you can go look through quote after quote after quote denying that there's a crisis at the border. And those of us who are going down to the border and we're going down and we're showing pictures and videos and we're posting them online of hundreds of people streaming across the border. And by the way, when that happens, the places between the ports of entry are then left exposed. We have areas where we have 70-mile stretches where there's only 2 miles of roads that are navigable by our Border Patrol along the Rio Grande River. The cane is so thick you can't see the river. Our Border Patrol agents are down on the water with a radio signal that doesn't work, cell signal that doesn't work, and they can't see the river, and there's only about one guy for every mile of stretch, and they're rotating in. And by the way, with the numbers coming in and the humanitarian crisis that Eric's talking about, the Democrats act like they just solved the problem. We're throwing money at it, but we're not actually stemming the tide of the flow. So all we're doing is having Border Patrol go in and into the housing business. So our Border Patrol agents are actually manning these facilities to house people coming across, but they're not manning the border. So then what happens? Narcotics flowing in between. Because we're catching the people who want to get caught. These are people who come across the river and they look for Border Patrol and say, hi, I'm here. And then we take them in and they go through asylum proceedings and other proceedings. They know they're going to get caught and released. Of the 800,000 people that were apprehended, I'm not talking about those who got through without being apprehended. 800,000 that were apprehended between October 1 and the end of June. 450,000, roughly, these are rough numbers, were family units that were caught and released. I asked on the record in a hearing, are the most of those people just now scattered throughout the United States? Answer, yes. They get caught, they get released immediately. There's another 200,000 of individuals, usually males, that are still being detained and processed. Many of them get released. Then you have the unaccompanied children. About 80,000, about 10% of all of this discussion is about those unaccompanied children. Then they get put into HHS facilities to be managed. The whole debate about this bill that got passed 2 months ago, $4 billion, after Democrats fought and whined and wouldn't do anything about it, was all about the money basically to deal with those children in HHS. None of it was going to fund ICE. And one last point, Eric. ICE funding, they got $200 million in the last bill for ICE funding. That's a number that doesn't mean anything to y'all. But I'll tell you, it came with all the restrictions. They can't use it to actually go do their job and then take bodies in and then process ICE, hold them so that we can then remove them. Instead, they're hamstrung so we catch and release them. President Obama asked for $1 billion in ICE funding 5 years ago. $1 billion. President Obama did. We couldn't even get $200 million out of these folks when the crisis is as bad as it is right now.
So, I mean, what's the state of play on this? Is it just going to be a political issue? Is there anything that can be done?
Well, we're continuing to turn the heat up. You know, a bunch of us signed a letter saying we shouldn't have adjourned in August. I don't believe that the United States Congress should have adjourned and gone home to their states for fundraisers and to go on travel and even to do events like this, which are great, if we haven't done our job to secure the border. And I think this is going to be an issue that's going to stay on the front burner between now and November of 2020. And our job is not to let it be just a political issue, but to keep the heat up that we need to do something. We can solve the problem. We could solve it in about 24 hours. At a hearing, I asked the DHS secretary, is it not true that we could solve what is called the catch and release problem, which is the Flores settlement and an extension by a judicial ruling in the Ninth Circuit? Could we not solve that on one piece of paper and pass it in one bill, one piece of paper, one page? He said yes. Could we not solve the problem that we can't return these unaccompanied children safely to their homes on one piece of paper? He said yes, we can. And is it also not true that Barack Obama supported fixes like those that would fit on one piece of paper? The answer was yes, we could. We just need to turn the heat up. But look, with all due respect to our leadership in both the House and the Senate, they're not doing it. Why aren't all House Republicans in Washington right now on the steps of the Capitol demanding to go into the House chamber, demanding that we do our job instead of going home? It's because they're not doing their job.
In that regard, I want to get a little bit more political with you, particularly about you and your race. The Democrats have decided to put Wendy Davis up against you in Texas, and in addition to her other issues, this is one of those areas as well where she and the Democrats see eye to eye on this issue, and they're already attacking you for being so focused on this issue, potentially at the expense of your own constituents in your district. Texans, it seems like, because they're a border state, understand this issue more than most, and it seems absurd to me that the Democrats are attacking you for being fixated on this issue.
If Wendy Davis wants to come after me over the issue of immigration and border security, she can do it all day long. Because I can tell you what the people of the 21st Congressional District of Texas feel about it. They're tired of it. Go to San Antonio and see what's happening. Go to Austin and see what's happening. Go throughout the district and see what's happening. I'll welcome that challenge. Look, Eric knows this. Some of you in the audience know this who are friends. 8 years ago yesterday, I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. I had a 4-month-old daughter. I had a 2-year-old son. I was working for Governor Perry. We'd written his book. He was getting ready to run for president. And I was supposed to be in Charleston, South Carolina at the Resurgent Gathering with Eric and others to see Governor Perry announce his launch for president. Instead, I was in Houston at MD Anderson getting treatment. I was, very blessed to have come out cancer-free, and after treatment 5 months later. My point of telling that, and my beautiful wife Kara's here, and my son Charlie and Virginia, they're here in the back of the room, and as you all know who have gone through those kinds of things, it's the spouses that take the brunt of that sort of thing. It's not you. You're just going through the motions. But Kara took the brunt of that. Why do I bring this up? Because if anybody thinks that I care for 1 second what Wendy Davis or the Democrats in Texas or any Democrat in this country wants to say about me, then they are sorely mistaken. You go through cancer and you look down the barrel of that and then you get through it and you say, do I care what Democrats are going to say about me? No, not one lick. And Mark Meadows said something yesterday which was very smart and profound about what's actually going on in Washington. You have to let go of this job of being a congressman or a senator, in the clutches that these guys hold on to it, right? When they run for re-election as if it's some manna from heaven from the Lord or something that you're a congressman. You got to let go, right? You got to be willing to do what you said you were going to do. You got to be able to look at the people that you represent and say, I'm going to leave everything on the field fighting for freedom, that I'm going to make sure that I do everything I can to pass down a better republic to my children and grandchildren, and not worry about whether I get reelected next year. I didn't get elected to get reelected.
Meanwhile, your challenger seems to run for everything.
And lose a lot. And we'll make sure that happens again.
Good. Now, let's move on to other issues. We've talked about debt and deficit, and we've talked about immigration. The military. I know you've got military in your district.
Yep.
You are a strong proponent of our national defense, and yet it seems like, as we've mentioned, a lot of Republicans use defense as a way to say, well, we really can't cut spending because we'll be we'll be weakening our national security.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. When I campaigned, I started running a year and a half ago, and it was an 18-person field. It was very crowded, and got through in about 90 days, and we had a runoff and then won the general. I ran on securing the border, fiscal responsibility, balancing the budget, healthcare freedom, making sure our men and women have the tools they need, a clear mission, the care when they get home, and then getting Washington the hell out of the way of the American people. And that was it. That's what I think we need to do. And that's what I'm focused on every day. And on the military portion, we should not ask our men and women in uniform to put their lives on the line and go out and defend this country without having the tools they need to do their job, period, end of story. But hand in hand with that is having a clear mission and using the military sparingly but forcefully. And not, that's right. And not allowing some of our mission creep and some of these things to drag on and on and on. And so, I believe that we need to have a relook as a nation about what we're doing with our military. We are now 17 years into engagement in the Middle East. Now, I'm not suggesting here that we shouldn't be engaged in some of the activities that we're engaged in there. What I'm saying is we need to look at that very carefully. We've got authorizations of military force that are now 17 years old. We need to look at that. We need to make sure that when we're asking another young man or young woman to put their lives on the line, or you get these notices every week of another young man who was killed, and another young man was killed. And we have to ask ourselves why, and what are we doing? And let's also look in our own backyard in the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is on fire in many places. Venezuela, Mexico, Tamaulipas, the state right across the border from Brownsville and McAllen, is a level 4 state according to our State Department. That means it's a no-go zone. Honduras and El Salvador aren't level 4 states. They're level 3, right? This is what we've got going on in our own backyard. We should look at that. We should relook at what we're doing in the Middle East. Now, look, there are a lot of dangerous organizations and entities in the Middle East, and we can go into that separately, that we need to make sure we're continuing to fight against. We need to continue to keep an eye on Iran. We need to make sure that we're rebuilding our military and keeping up with China and Russia. I do not disagree with our traditional hawks who generally believe we need to continue to build up our military. But we cannot do that at the expense of our future ability to defend our nation. Secretary Mattis was correct, and former General Mattis, when he said that the biggest national security threat to the United States of America is our national debt. And if we don't get our hands around that, we will not be able to defend our nation in 5 years, 10 years, and 20 years forward. So I believe very much it is in our national defense interest to get our hands around our spending and make sure that we do that right. And I'll say that, representing Fort Sam Houston, the Army's Future Command, the 90,000 veterans in the district, And I've rarely had anybody disagree with any of the points I just made.
I want to touch on something you said because it's right in my wheelhouse these days. I am more and more convinced 17 years in, and I'm not saying we abandon Afghanistan and Iraq, because I think if we were to pack up and get out 100% tomorrow, bad people would move in, set up shop, and we'd be dealing with them again in 5 years. But we're there so much at the expense of the Western Hemisphere. We've totally forgotten the Monroe Doctrine. We have China now buying up mines and indebting South American and Central American countries to the extent that China takes land rights in their countries to get precious metals and minerals that the United States then is dependent on China on because they own these. That you got the Panama Canal situation with China. It seems like the rest of the world has figured out if you want to come after the United States, you set up shop in the Western Hemisphere, and we're letting it happen.
Well, this is an important point, and we could have a whole session on this, and people who are more expert than I. And look, this is one of those things that, and I'll make a side note here. Too often in Washington, elected officials start speaking out as experts on things they don't know anything about. In fact, that's the vast majority of the commentary that goes on in Washington. And we see it every day in hearings. You know, you got these guys who get up and they use their 5-minute questioning to give a speech. It's like, what? I mean, you got 5 witnesses there. Why aren't you asking them questions? This is an area that is probably the area I know less about relative to other issues. I was a Senate Judiciary staffer, a federal prosecutor. You know, I've got other expertises. I worked in banking, oil and gas. So I know a lot of issues. But I know less about national security issues, right? And so I'm taking my time before I try to speak out too much on those, about what's going on in Afghanistan and Syria. We've invested a lot of time, energy, blood, treasure to try to fight back, and we've had a lot of victories, important victories. It's important to celebrate those victories in beating back terrorists who want to do us harm or go after Israel. However, what you just said is right. We've got to focus in our own backyard. Look, this is right directly connected to our border situation. Like I just said, the number of other than Mexicans, which is the term of art that you use for people who are coming across our border not from Mexico, continues to skyrocket, right? It is now the lion's share of the people coming across our border. And people are coming from all over the world. When I went to the ICE facility, you all saw this ridiculous event where these people stormed the facility in Aurora, Colorado, outside of Denver, and they took down the American flag, defaced it, and then they raised the Mexican flag. I was in Colorado that week, so I went to the facility the next day, met with the people who ran that facility, and it is a clean facility. People have TVs, ping pong tables, medicine. They have all of the things you need, dental facilities. They had video games, 3 square meals. And these are people, by the way, that are now getting filled in who came across our border. 57 countries are represented in that facility, in this ICE facility with 2,000 people being detained. That's what you're dealing with. So to your point, the basics of defending your nation is to secure your border. That's like issue number 1, right? It is our sovereign responsibility.
Let me ask you more about your campaign here. We got a lot of people who here from Texas, but a lot of people who aren't from Texas.
Right.
What do people do to help you in your race?
Well, you know, you always hate to, this is an event here, we come to talk policy, and Erick's a friend, so I don't want to make this a campaign pitch. You need resources. She raised $250 grand the first day she announced. She's going to raise a bunch of money along the Beto model, and they're going to try to make it that kind of a race. And so we need resources. We're doing pretty well, but we're going to need more. And the small dollars, look, I love small dollars. I'm happy as I can be when I get a $5 or $10 or $25 contribution from someone throughout the district or around the country who just wants freedom. Because then you are less beholden, hat in hand, going out to particular areas with wealthy donors or you know, the big money interest. I would rather have, you know, 20,000, you know, $100 donors, right? That makes you stronger. It makes you represent the people that you know you're out there wanting to represent easier. So any kind of financial support is always great. But honestly, it's just keep fighting the fight. You know, Heritage Sentinels that are in the room, people that are out there that are engaged. I know a lot of you. I've seen you out there because I've been a part of the grassroots for the last 15 years. Stay engaged. We've got to win this fight. This is a freedom versus socialism fight. It is real. The 4 speakers, as I call them, because Nancy Pelosi has ceded her speakership to these 4 ladies.
4 speakers of the apocalypse?
Exactly. It's exactly right. You know, this is a real fight, okay? You know, just last night on one of the networks, I can't remember, one of the comedy channels or something, somebody sent me a clip where I think it was, it was Bill Maher. And Bill Maher said something along the lines of, hey guys, you know, we just got to have Joe Biden. Can we all just come together and recognize we need Joe Biden, and don't worry, we can have our revolution later, right? They get it, right? They want to do whatever they can to knock off the president, to be able to reclaim power and then set the table for a full-scale socialist revolution. It is 100% in works, and it is our job to stand up and fight that and to push elected officials. Mark said it yesterday when he gave his example about the duds you get in your shotgun if you're out shooting and you kick it out and you get a new shell. We need more of that. There are too many duds in Congress in both parties. There are way too many, I'm telling you. People who run away from the fight. They don't want to stand up and speak the truth. But we've got to do that. This is just like, you know, when the revolution occurred, it was not a majority of the population that wanted to go to war with their family in Britain. It was not. It was a small minority. And as Sam Adams said, it was a small minority willing to set brush fires of freedom. That's what you are. You're the group that does that. That's who Erick is. That's every one of you that's out there on blogs and in Twitter and out there pushing the right narrative, getting people energized. Show up in Texas, in Texas 21, but in Georgia and across the country. Make sure Jody Heiss wins in a landslide. Make sure Mark Meadows has support. Ted Budd, a lot of the Freedom Caucus people. Support the House Freedom Fund. The House Freedom Fund doesn't do a lot of the take money off the top efforts that the swamp does into sort of make sure they're protecting the DC swamp class. The House Freedom Fund and the House Freedom Caucus is trying to reward patriots for being willing to stand up against the swamp and the powers that be in the establishment. And let me just say a note about Erick. Erick's been doing this for years, and he is a singular force in the conservative movement that we should all be thankful is continuing to stay in the movement.
Thank you.
And he won't let me finish. He's going to want to jump in and cut me off, but it really is. He has been a singular force in trying to help us move forward and move the ball forward. And many of you know some of the struggles that he and his family has dealt with and his beautiful wife. And we should all keep him and his family in our prayers, but make sure you keep doing what you're doing with the Resurgent and keep giving a platform so we can continue to get the word out.
Thank you. The couple minutes we've got left here, if you could just real quick, kind of explain, because I don't think people outside of Texas understand, maybe in Georgia they kind of do, but what the Democrats have decided that they really want to make Texas some level of battleground after 2018.
Sure, I mean, it is real. We've now seen a few retirements in Texas, and the Democrats are trying to make a lot out of that. But let's dissect them a little bit and look at the actual facts on the ground. We've got a situation where we thought Ratcliffe was going to go to DNI, so that was an open seat. That's not occurring now. He's staying in the House, and he's a good man, and he represents a good district. You got Pete Olson, who retired, who's been in the House for, I think, I don't know, 12 years or a while, and it was a natural time to retire. You know, Will Hurd is always a 50-50 seat. Will's a good man. I like Will. We disagree a lot on the issues. He would, if he were right here, we would say that. And it's a tough district. It's Texas 23. It's along the border. And Will's done a good job trying to fight and work through that district. But now let's go get a new person to run in that seat and in 22. Mike Conaway retired. It's a strong Republican seat. It will be a Republican. Let's get a strong conservative in the primary. And then let's go run on offense. This business that you've got Texas is on its heels is something the Democrats want the narrative to become real. Now, we're under assault. Don't get me wrong. The targets are on our back. They're going to spend tens of millions of dollars in Texas to try to flip it, and they're going to succeed if we don't do our job. But a couple of positive notes. When I was on the campaign trail last year, I can't tell you how many people were like this one woman, I'll give you this example, who came up to me at an event in Bernie, Texas, and she gave me a $1,000 check, and she said, I just moved here from California. You have to win because I have nowhere else to move. And that's the deal.
If you want to find out how to support Congressman Roy in his reelection, Senator Perdue in his, or you want just general action items on being an activist, remember to text the word ARMY to 33777. You'll be able to sign up for the activist list for the Resurgent. And Congressman Roy, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Erick. Appreciate it.
Thank you, man. That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. we're going to let you stretch your legs for about 15 minutes, get some coffee, then come back and start talking about how you can get really involved in the process. Listen, I keep the trains running. People will start floating back into the room. They're getting caffeinated. While y'all are here, I'm going to go get caffeinated. One of the groups in our country that I have consistently recommended since they formed is Heritage Action for America. I dearly love them. I have been a huge proponent of theirs for a number of years. I have flown all over this country promoting them. I'm delighted that they were able to sponsor this year. And they do brilliant jobs at teaching people advocacy in government, teaching people how to be on the ground, engaged and informed. The Heritage Sentinel program, you heard Congressman Roy talk about it, a great group of activists. And I want to invite on stage to start talking about some activism in building a mandate for 2020, Stephanie Cruz, who is a regional manager for Heritage Action for America, and James Quarles, who's the Southeast Regional Coordinator. People, if you live in the Southeast of the United States, you need to know them anyway, so please give them a warm welcome.
Well, thanks so much for having us, Eric. It's great to be here in Atlanta. Again, as you said, my name is Stephanie Cruz. I'm a regional manager at Heritage Action, and this is my colleague, James. We're really, really excited to be here. So for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with Heritage Action, we are the sister organization of the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1973. They really do the work of putting together policy research and innovative ideas. And our job at Heritage Action is to really take that research, take all of that information, and work to make it a reality. And we do that through what we like to call our inside-outside strategy. So we have our team that is inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C., on a day-to-day basis, really working to advance those conservative ideas, meeting with members of Congress, some of which you've gotten to hear from this weekend, and their staff, really working, I think, to kind of translate those conservative ideas into actual legislative text, and then also, I think, really working to strategize, of course, to advance those ideas, and then Washington is never short on bad ideas as well, and so working to kind of oppose and block some of those as well. So that's kind of our inside strategy, but James and I get to really work on what we consider sort of the outside game of Heritage Action, which is the grassroots, which really is just everyday citizens who are working in their communities to advance conservative ideas in their counties and in their congressional districts. And so it's really, I think, an incredible opportunity. We love working with what we call Heritage Action Sentinels, so people who are standing on the front lines of freedom, working to defend freedom in their local districts. So we, I think, really want to spend kind of the next 45 minutes talking through just kind of some of the practical thoughts that we have in terms of, how you can really begin to take action in terms of getting involved in the legislative process. I know we've talked to a lot of folks this weekend. Some of you are seasoned veterans in the political process. You're involved in kind of your local communities. Some of you, this is kind of your first foray into politics, and so we want to really kind of begin to dive into sort of 4 areas that we really see opportunities, because we really see grassroots as being key, I think, a key component to really winning on conservative policy ideas and moving the ball forward. So James, talk us a little bit through sort of this first thing that we were kind of thinking through in terms of opportunities for conservatives to get, really grassroots to get involved.
Sure. So thanks for having us. Again, I'm James Quarles. I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator for Heritage Action. I cover the Southeast region, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee. We wanted to talk today about, and I don't know if we have the slides up on the screen yet or not, but really just that the left is increasingly out of touch with the American voting public, right? And you probably heard from our colleague Nathan Rogers yesterday and talked a little bit about the polling that we did at Heritage Action to figure out, right, where are the voters, especially in swing districts and swing states, where are they on the issues, especially as they relate to the proposals that the left are putting out right now. And the first thing we wanted to talk about today is exposing the left's radical positions, because that's what they are, right? We've heard a lot of talk this weekend so far of some of the crazy proposals that are out there. And I've got a couple of examples here. One is immigration, right? It's just a vast, vast difference in where the left is on this issue and where The vast majority of the American people are. Actually, for a large majority of voters in swing districts and states, immigration is a top issue. It's a very important issue to them. And when you look at the polling, it bears out that it's not because, hey, we want just open borders. They want a robust legal immigration system, but to fix our broken illegal immigration system. Medicare for all, or single payer as the left calls it, is wildly unpopular. 70% of voters in swing districts oppose getting rid of private health insurance, which is exactly what Medicare for all would do, right? Every single candidate on the Democratic debate stage this past week and in their first debate a few weeks back proposed and raised their hand when they were asked if they would do away or would support a Medicare for all package, which is getting rid of private health insurance. It's wildly unpopular for 70% of the voting people there in swing districts and states around the country. Socialism, just from a top-line perspective, with economic systems, socialism is wildly unpopular too. Only 20% of voters in these places think that socialism is the preferable economic system when compared with capitalism. That's an encouraging number to point to, but also realize, again, on the left, many of the candidates for office right now are espousing socialist policies. That's an opportunity. But it's not just on these. I think there's a real opportunity, especially on social issues. So that's where I think in the past there has been almost a tendency among politicians running for office to focus on the voters who are fiscally conservative but socially liberal or just agnostic on those issues, which if you look at the actual voting public and where their opinions are on policy, that section of the electorate is actually very small in comparison to the people who care about social issues from a conservative standpoint and are fiscally conservative. So we as conservatives, I think, are right to focus on both fiscal and social issues as well as defense, but there is a real opportunity on the social side of things here. And there are two examples that I want to talk through while we're here today, one of which is life, right? So I know that Nathan Rogers, our colleague yesterday, mentioned this, but 76% of people believe that if a baby is born as a result of a failed abortion, that baby should be entitled to medical care that could potentially save their lives, right? Unfortunately, right now, there is a gap in federal law where there is no real defined duty of care for these infants who survive abortions. So we're not talking about abortion, we're talking about a baby who is alive, outside the mother, surviving on its own for the time being, but it needs medical care, just like any other baby who's born prematurely, and could be easily saved with just medical care. So the Born Alive Abortion Survivor Protection Act is a bill that would address this issue. Now, keep in mind, 76% of people, that's not 76% of conservatives, that's not 76% of Republicans, that's 76% of all voters in these swing states. And in fact, I think the number across the board is closer to 78%. So it's almost an 80-20 issue that people agree that, hey, this is a no-brainer. We should have a duty of care for these infants here. But what happened with this Born Alive bill in the House of Representatives, it was introduced by a Republican member, and they asked for a roll call vote on it, an up or down vote, and Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats blocked those efforts. And as of last week, they've blocked those efforts 76 times. The 76th time took place just this past week. So it's funny, they blocked the effort for 76 times, and 76% of people think that's a bad idea. Okay. So in reality, what we need to do here is point out just how vast the difference is in the policy that they're pushing or opposing there and the place where the American people are on the issue. So there is a way to get people on the record here. So practically speaking, there is what's called a procedural tool called a discharge petition, which if it garners the signature of a majority of House members, which is 218 is the required number, the bill would bypass the committee process. It would go to the floor within a certain number of legislative days for an up or down vote. So right now there are 201 signatures on the discharge petition. So we lack 17 as of right now. All Republicans have signed on so far, and 3 Democrats have signed on. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, well, this is a 76% people oppose this, or 76% of people agree with this policy. It's almost an 80-20 issue. That is a slam dunk frankly, for both parties in Congress. Anytime you can find an 80-20 issue, that's something that you really want to jump onto. But right now, 100% of the Republicans in the House have signed on to this discharge petition saying that they are in favor of providing this medical care for these babies. Meanwhile, only 3 Democrats out of their majority of over 218 members have signed on. That's a vast difference, and it's a way to get them on record. So right now, we need 17 more signatures on the discharge petition that will all have to come from Democrats. So we need to be asking Democratic members, and especially Democratic members who represent red districts or swing districts, especially in Georgia 6 with Lucy McBath, to sign on to this discharge petition. This is a no-brainer, but even if they don't, and even if we don't end up with the majority of signatures on the discharge petition, this is an excellent way to get them on the record and to highlight their positions, right? I mean, this is an issue that 80% almost of Americans think is a good idea to do. This is our opportunity to point out just how wild their position on this is. The other example here that I wanted to talk about is the Equality Act, and many of you may have heard of this. If you haven't, it is a Democratic priority bill. It's H.R. 5 in the House of Representatives. What it would do basically is add sexual orientation and gender identity as 2 protected classes under civil rights law and federal law. So that has wide-ranging consequences for especially religious liberty. It's very difficult also to enforce. I mean, when you're talking about oftentimes behavior and things that gender identity, for example, is literally a definition of what you identify as at this moment, right? It can change, and oftentimes it does change. It's really it's tough to apply this law in a way that protects religious liberty, and it's ultimately at odds with that. Now, what this bill does, it has wide-ranging consequences in real life, not just from kind of a nebulous religious liberty standpoint, but there are some real bad things that happen as a result of this. Some examples are pro-life organizations, pro-life adoption agencies, such as, there's one I think in North Carolina, I forget the name of it at the moment, but they seek to adopt children into families with both a mother and a father that accords with their faith. They believe that in Scripture, Scripture is the Word of God, and that is the teaching of their faith, and so they seek to serve their community according to their faith. Well, if the Equality Act were to be put in place, these organizations like this that operate under faith statements like that would either be forced with totally going against their religious beliefs and morals, totally sacrificing their principles on that stand, or closing their doors and helping no children, for example. It's a tough position to be in, and I know that many organizations so far have already come under fire with lawsuits, being targeted by the left in this way, and that's not popular at all. 65% of people think that organizations like those should be able to serve their communities according to their own religious beliefs and morals. That's not that controversial. It's a really large majority there. Another example is, and I know that many of you have probably heard about this on the news in recent days, with biological males who are transgender competing on female sports teams or against female competitors. This is another real issue, and it's not just because of hurt feelings or anything like that. A lot of times, sports is the avenue to education, and oftentimes, a lot of females will get scholarships to college because they are standout athletes in their sport. Unfortunately, when these biological males compete in those sports, it takes away opportunities for these females to be able to compete in their own sport in a fair manner. And that's also wildly unpopular. It's 62% for that one that think that is a crazy policy. And then we don't have polling on this last one, but it is just a very stark contrast of what the left is pushing. In Alaska, a municipal government in Alaska, there has a homeless shelter there, and actually a transgender individual, a biological male, has basically been allowed to, the shelter's been forced to allow him to sleep merely 3 feet away in the same room as other females who have been victims of rape, of sexual assault, and domestic violence. So for these women, it is traumatizing to be having to sleep 3 feet away from a biological male oftentimes. And really what this law does is just take away these spaces that females have, whether it's locker rooms, whether it's bathrooms, whether it's homeless shelters, the religious space, whether it's organizations serving according to their beliefs, and the list goes on and on and on. There are all kinds of bad things, but the point here remains, yes, the bill is unpopular as itself, but the individual policies and the individual outcomes of this bill are equally, if not more so, unpopular when we point these things out. If you ask someone, are you in favor of this kind of thing? They say, no, absolutely not. That's crazy, right? And I think that represents a real opportunity for us to be able to just highlight, say, well, this is a major priority of the left. It's one of their top 5 priorities, in fact. It's H.R. 5. They list their bills 1 through 10 for their top priorities. And in fact, this bill actually passed the House of Representatives with every Democrat voting in favor of it. So this is, we'll talk a little bit more about that particular bill a little bit later, but those are just some examples of where we can point out just the absurdity of the left's radical positions. But Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about some practical things that we can do to maybe make this even more stark on the ground here?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question because obviously I think, the folks in this room were the kind of, people who are sharing on our social media pages. I think there's also really great opportunities for us to think about things like letters to the editor. I know in today's day and age, it can feel a little tough to break through the news cycle, but I always tell, our Sentinels, they for sure are not going to publish your letter if you don't submit it. And so your odds of getting published are at least better if you submit it. But I think there's 2 things that really stand out to me, in particular to the time that we're in right now, which is August. So in August, we have in the House and the Senate, you have what's called a district work period, which we all call recess. So you have the opportunity for you to get, I think, more access to your member of Congress. I think the ability to really grab a little bit more attention because I think attention tends to turn a little bit back more towards the district. And so you've got, the House started their recess this week. The Senate will start their recess next week, and so members are just a little bit more accessible, which I think kind of provides 2 opportunities. One is to meet with them, which might sound a little counterintuitive to try to ask to meet with a Democrat member, but I think it really, I think, is something that also can often make a difference at the end of the day. You may not necessarily see the fruit of your kind of activism efforts, but I think what was really interesting to me in talking to one of our colleagues who had worked on the Hill for a conservative member, he shared a story about, working for that member. He's like, we met with constituents who are affiliated with Planned Parenthood. It didn't necessarily change the outcome of our vote at the end of the day, but you can be sure that when we were going to the floor, that meeting weighed on our mind. And so I think there's an opportunity for us to really insert ourselves into this debate, to really engage on some of these issues like the Born Alive discharge petition. I think, we're always looking to put out resources at Heritage Action. We have kind of a claims and response that we've got on our website of kind of how to navigate sort of the debate and those conversations with some of the kind of just rebutting some of the excuses that we've heard from Democrats on, why they're opposed to this particular bill. But I think the second thing that, if you can't meet with that member, maybe you're not, able to kind of have sort of that one-on-one personal accountability moment, to really think about what we sometimes call public accountability. So really kind of engaging, I think, back to the idea of educating and exposing the radical positions of the left, to really, I think, begin to look for opportunities to educate your community. And I think that comes down to a lot of times thinking about things like sine waves and rallies. It's a little maybe old school, kind of gritty grassroots, but I think looking for opportunities to really draw attention in a way that lets us educate. So I know it can feel a little tough sometimes in a little bit of a bigger media market like Atlanta, but I think there's things that we can sometimes do to really be able to capture attention a little bit more effectively. So I think timing can sometimes play a role in terms of if you're doing something midday, sometimes there's more staff available on kind of a Friday midday than if you're doing something on a Saturday or during kind of rush hour. I think the second thing really that's key in terms of thinking about making these events a success is thinking about the visuals. So not just telling the story, but sort of showing and kind of creating a visual component to your story. So if you're talking about babies born alive and you've got a member who's maybe flip-flop back and forth, think about something with baby flip-flops, that kind of brings sort of an illustration to the humanity and kind of creates a visual that sort of helps highlight and kind of bring interest to your story in a way that's a little bit more visually compelling. And then I think also just remembering our audience, which is our communities. So a lot of times, I think we can get caught up in just sort of, there's the radical left's position, but there's a lot of people who maybe have open minds or they don't know the radical position that their member has taken. And we have a real opportunity by kind of drawing attention to the issue to educate. And then I think to really kind of amplify and kind of create some pressure on that member to respond.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about some things where there are already these debates going on. Oftentimes the debate is not already going on, or maybe people don't want to have the debate, or maybe the media is focused on something completely different. What can we do when the debate's not going on? Are there ways to force these? And can you talk us through what that might look like?
Yeah, so I think the question is when there's not a debate, how do you start one? How do you kind of pick sort of that legislative fight? And I think, we talked a little bit about the idea of a discharge petition where you're working to kind of build signatures, get members on record, in the event of either getting your bill to the floor or kind of exposing, who quite frankly supports infanticide and who is unwilling to go on record. But I think the other kind of legislative tool in the toolkit to highlight is something called motions to recommit. And I think it really helps, or I think Newt Gingrich really had a great quote, and he said that you have to give the press confrontations. Because when you give them, confrontations, you get attention. And when you get attention, you get the opportunity to educate. And so looking for these opportunities to create legislative conflict in a way that draws attention and lets you educate. And I think that's where something like a motion to recommit can really be kind of a tool in your legislative toolkit to do that. And so I think the way to think about a motion to recommit, if you really want to kind of get into the sort of the technical weeds of how they work, come see me afterwards. But I think the simplest way to think about them is before the House votes on a bill, right before the final passage vote, there's a vote on what's called a motion to recommit. It's kind of the final stop before the passage vote. And so the minority party has the opportunity to offer this. So that means anyone who is planning to vote no. And the functional way that it really tends to work is it's more or less something along the lines of an amendment vote. It's a lot of different ways that it can kind of take shape, but it really, I think, kind of takes shape often as an amendment vote. Now, the excuse that you're going to hear, I think, from, in particular, a Democrat member is, well, this is just a procedural vote. It's just kind of a formality. It doesn't really matter. This is just an attempt of the Republicans to divide the Democrats. I think at the end of the day, what that really says is they don't want to go on record. They don't want to go on record, because it puts them in a tough position, because it's highlighting an issue that maybe their constituents see a little differently. And so I think, we've actually seen some really good procedural hardball from the Republicans this Congress. I think kind of 3 sort of motion to recommit votes that stand out that kind of illustrate how this can be used is, the first, I think, time we saw it used successfully was there was a vote on Yemen, and they attached a motion to recommit that condemned anti-Semitism. And the vote on that motion to recommit was 424 to 0. So every single Democrat voted for the substance of that motion. And so really, I think that kind of set the stage for this to become an accountability point. I mean, they voted on the actual substance of the legislation, and this begins kind of a policy conversation, because we also saw yet another motion to recommit pass this Congress. So we had H.R. 8, which was the bipartisan background check bill, dealing with gun control. The left was, attempting to increase gun control, and there was a motion that was offered that would have required that ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, be notified in the event that an illegal immigrant attempts to purchase a firearm and fails a background check. And that actually also passed. I think the vote was something like 220 to 209. And so that kind of draws that contrast, I think, kind of creates sort of, quite frankly, it does create, I think, tension in the Democrat Party in a way that raises an issue to the surface in the media and allows kind of an opportunity to really, I think, educate and kind of, again, bring that issue to the surface. It doesn't always, I think, necessarily have to be a successful, quote, a successful vote where you pass the motion to recommit. I think we've also seen with a vote like on H.R. 1, which was the elections bill, there was a motion to recommit that expressed the sense that allowing illegal immigrants to vote dilutes kind of the voting power and kind of the voting franchise of U.S. citizens. And so kind of raises that conversation of who should be allowed to vote and what does it mean to be, a U.S. citizen. And so kind of raising that to the forefront of the conversation, I think is kind of, again, a little bit more potentially, I think, in the weeds, but I think is one of those things that we can use. And I think in terms of, kind of beginning the conversation of how do I actually kind of make a difference on this, I think it's one, encouraging kind of our friends on the right, those in the Republican Party, to make the most of these motions to recommit, really, being thoughtful about these and intentional about these, to use these in a way that help to force those meaningful debates. And then I think, too, using these as an accountability point with Democrats, and really kind of beginning the conversation on some of these, back to the idea of these radical policy positions that they hold. And so, James.
Well, so I think grassroots, we on the grassroots here on the ground have, especially in blue districts or swing districts, have some of the most important roles to play on this front. So anytime we're trying to force a debate, or especially anytime we're able to get members on record, have them answer for that some way, whether it be writing a letter to the editor to your local paper, or whether it be raising the issue at your church or to your friends and family, those sorts of things. Obviously, we want to be able to talk about, hey, this debate's going on. This is where I stand on the issue. My member of Congress maybe didn't agree with that stance and went on the other side of that issue. And really, the more that we're able to talk about some of these debates and fights that are going on publicly, we're going to be able to educate our friends and family and neighbors on these issues. And trust me, they're going to have opinions on this stuff. This is real life. It's not just wonky policy all the time. Sometimes it can feel that way, but I think so far the Republicans who have been kind of spearheading this motion to recommit strategy have done a good job of making it policies that real Americans care about, right? And so that's an important thing that we can be doing. But mainly it's about forcing the left to answer for their positions. If we don't do that, then we're really missing out on an opportunity and really a key plank of accountability. So while we're here talking about accountability, everyone needs accountability, right? It's the left, but also the right. Now that looks different in each regard. It can be both positive, it can be negative. It can sometimes use the terms carrot and stick. It looks different. So we talked about Democrats having to answer for their positions. But our next point here is keeping the right united against liberal priority legislation. So what this means, so I mentioned before a couple of the bills. The Equality Act is one. But really an excellent example of this is H.R. 1, which was the federal elections takeover bill. It's basically the Democrats' #1 priority. The House voted on this, and more or less what it would do is federalize elections. It would, among other things, allow basically anyone to vote. I think many of you heard yesterday that brought up how the wording of the bill, I think it was Congressman Collins who pointed that out. According to the wording of the bill, you cannot stop anyone from voting, which is absurd. It's basically a naked partisan attempt to skew the electoral process in the favor of the Democrats, and that's more or less what the bill is designed to do. So it's obviously their top priority. It's a huge priority for them, but it's a great example on this front of keeping the right united because 0 Republicans voted in favor of that bill when it passed the House. So it passed the House with all Democrat votes, and it's dead on arrival in the Senate right now, which, I mean, that's about as stark as you can get. You can say, okay, well, hey, the Democrats are in favor of this. Here's why that's a bad thing, but by the way, there's a better way, right? Republicans did not add their names to that bill, did not give it credence, did not give it any kind of momentum. And that's an important aspect of this. I think another good example is the Equality Act that I mentioned before. And this is an example of where maybe we can do a better job of accountability. The Equality Act, I mean, we talked about what it does, and for all of those bad policy outcomes, unfortunately, there were 8 Republicans who voted for that bill, one of whom was a co-sponsor of the bill, which is unfortunate. But with a policy like that has such wide-ranging effects for society as a whole, you really don't want to go adding momentum or giving that bill extra life, right? The second thing we want to point out here is that once a member votes for a policy and goes on record in one way or the other, it's harder later to get them to switch their position. I'm not going to say that it's baked in permanently, and trust me, it's never too late to get it right. If you change your opinion and you change your vote to the right side later, hey, more power to you, that's awesome. But unfortunately, once a member of Congress goes on record in favor or against a certain policy, it is harder to get them to flip later on. So we don't want them to get baked in there. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that we just don't want, Republican members of Congress, but really just any of us, to get caught sleeping on these votes and these issues. Now, when it's a Democratic priority bill like H.R. 1 or H.R. 5 or H.R. 8, it might be easier to spot. It's going to be announced with fanfare by the left. It's going to be announced, and the leadership is going to tout it. They're going to go out and talk about this great bill that we passed, and oh, it's so good for the American people. Why are you not supporting this great bill called the Equality Act? Who can be against that, right? But it's for the smaller policies, and especially on kind of the more obscure policies that we need to keep our eyes open. And the point here is that the Equality Act, yes, it passed the House. It's dead on arrival in the Senate. But look at it like this. It's like the whole loaf, right? The left would be ecstatic if they got that bill passed into law. It's not going to happen with a Republican majority in the Senate and President Trump in the White House. But they will be just as happy to splinter off individual policies like this and kind of shoehorn them into what's called must-pass bills in other places. They do this almost every time a National Defense Authorization Act comes up. They will put SOGI language, basically the operative language of the Equality Act, to basically make our military a social experiment instead of about national defense. They'll add it to appropriations bills, things that are very difficult for many members to vote against for parochial reasons or different reasons like that, whether it be district interest or whatever. But they'll put these bad policies in there and dare members to vote against the underlying package. So we really need to be vigilant on this stuff. We can't just be on the lookout for a particular bill. We need to be on the lookout for a policy and this push that they're doing. So, we've talked a lot about kind of the legislative side, but what can we do practically on that? I think this kind of goes along with what Stephanie said about the August recess earlier, but for Republican members, right? So set up a meeting with your member. Just talk about these issues, point out the fact that, hey, a lot of these proposals that are coming out, especially of these Democratic offices, are quite frankly terrible. Not many people agree with these, but it's important that we not just sit back and disagree with it. We need to be out there talking about the consequences of these bills. It's real life consequences, and it's consequences that are extremely unpopular, so we can point to those. You'll be out and you'll see them around at events, especially in August, as they're going around to groups, as they're going to community events and stuff like that. Be sure you introduce yourself. If they voted against H.R. 5, the Equality Act, which every member of the Georgia delegation did, be sure and thank them for that. Be sure and thank them for standing up against those terrible policies. And it's not just H.R. 5, it's really anything. Anytime they take a tough vote and stand for conservative principle, be sure you're thanking them, because that goes a long way. A creative way to do that is not just thanking them in person, which is great. Always do that any chance you get whenever they're doing the right thing. But I know that this idea was tossed out yesterday in one of the sessions, that get a group of people together and write some thank you cards that you can deliver to the office, hand deliver to the member, and you can rest assured that they're going to see those, or at least see the stack, hear, hey, like all these people thanked you for taking a righteous stand on this, wanted to pass this along. So don't miss an opportunity to be able to do that, because that's a really important part of just helping out the people who are fighting for principle to continue to do so and stay in the fight. And if it's a big issue, like Born Alive or anything like this, where they're really like leading the charge, they're out there, they are on the news, they're talking about the issue, maybe it's worth doing a sign wave or something like that. I heard one really impactful example of a group of concerned citizens who really appreciated a vote that their member had just taken, and he was on the way back from Congress, flying back to the district, and at the route from the airport, like on the way to his office, they lined the streets in the rain with signs that said, "Thank you, Congressman, for this." And I remember him telling that story, and it he almost broke down in tears talking about like how meaningful it was for him to feel that thankfulness back home in the district. So don't miss an opportunity to do that. I mean, we want to try to help these guys out any way we can and really thank them when they're doing the right thing. So, Stephanie, I know we've talked a lot about kind of the here and now, the legislative battles like at this moment, but we don't want to lose sight of what's happening between now and the 2020 election. We don't just want to sit on our rear ends and twiddle our thumbs and miss opportunities to build for the future. What are some things that we can do to kind of do that and put lead on the target and really be ready to pound the pavement later?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question because I think it's really important that we not get too, ahead of ourselves and also be engaging in the legislative fights that are here and now, but also be thinking about what's ahead. And I think at the end of the day, we as conservatives, we're not just here to gain political power for its own sake, right? We're here to be able to advance conservative policy ideas and to move those and make those a reality. And so I think the kind of first thing that I'll say kind of on kind of looking ahead to 2020 and sort of how do we build momentum for a conservative policy agenda, I think it kind of goes back to some of what Nate, our colleague, was talking about yesterday, which is really encouraging, I think, especially our friends on the right, to run on a bold conservative agenda. I think, sort of the polling that we've seen shows a lot of really great opportunities and a lot of overlap between some of the issues that are animating the electorate, I think anxieties that they have, and also where we have conservative solutions to those questions and to some of those anxieties. And so really encouraging them to be bold, to build that agenda and to really build an agenda that's going to inspire the American people. So I think that's where we can really, as we're building those relationships with kind of our Republican congressmen, to really encourage them to take advantage of that and to be bold and to lead. But I think in terms of, what does it look like for kind of us as sort of everyday citizens, we're not in Congress, maybe we're just kind of on the beginnings of getting involved into politics. What can we really do? Because I think we talked about, a lot of different ideas because we want to kind of share just sort of some of the things that are a little bit more out of the box. A lot of folks kind of get started with calling their member of Congress or they're getting on social media, but we also want to kind of share some of the things that you can do in terms of taking that next step in terms of really, I think, leading in your communities. And that goes back to, I think, the three things that we really always encourage Sentinels to do, which is our kind of grassroots program. And it's to really, I think, know, to grow, and to go. And so I think to know the issues, the policy issues are hard. I think really at Heritage Action is for you to know a policy issue just as well or better than your member of Congress, which quite frankly sometimes does happen.
It happens all the time.
It does happen. We really want them to be smart and to be knowledgeable about the issues and to be able to go toe-to-toe with anyone in a policy debate. And so I think that's really important that we educate ourselves first and foremost and to be smart on the issues. I think the second thing is really, I think, what I think in terms of kind of a key priority now, between now and 2020, which is building our networks and really growing your network. And I think that term can get thrown around, and I remember kind of coming out of college and everyone talked about the importance of networking, and it felt like this really nebulous thing that was a little intimidating of I just need to go introduce myself to really important people. And I think it really just starts with introducing yourself to your neighbor at your table. I think it can feel really daunting. So I say this as an introvert, quite frankly. There is nothing, part of my job means working rooms, but there's also part of me as an introvert that's a little hard. And so I think it just quite frankly starts with introducing yourself to your neighbor. So I think, for this weekend, introduce yourself to the person who's sitting next to you at that round table. And then I think over time that builds. I once heard the expression, the more people you know, the more people you know. The more people you know, the more that your network can introduce you to their network and you continue to build your network. And I think the reason that matters is it helps you, I think, really to build influence because then you're a known person in your community and people know you. They know that you know the issues, that you're smart on the policy, and that you're kind of connected in your community. You're not just some person who showed up, but you're invested and really being a part of growing, and advancing conservative policies in your community. And I think the thing that I always think about with kind of what we call kind of grassroots activism, which is really, I think, just everyday citizens getting involved in the legislative process is really what it's a fancy kind of term for that. But I think the thing that I've really been struck by over the years as I've worked kind of in the trenches of politics with just everyday citizens who want to get involved, which is it really builds compound interest. The more that you know the issues, the more that you know that issue the next time it comes around the legislative process. The more people you know, the more people that you continue to be able to build your network with. You know, I've kind of walked kind of alongside different kind of sentinels that started off as just a citizen who, you know, started with maybe a tough conversation with a member that got, you know, a little heated and were a little daunted, to now have the cell phone number of their member of Congress and their U.S. Senator and are engaging them in meaningful conversations on the policy fights that are happening today. And so I think at the end of the day, you know, you don't always see maybe the highest return on investment at the beginning, but I think the longer that you really stick out with getting involved in the political process in your community, I think the more impact that you are able to have over the long run and really, I think, make a difference.
Yeah, well, you mentioned sentinels of ours who have, over the years, built relationships with their members and now have their cell phone numbers and can text with them. I mean, I don't want to miss a key point here. I mean, it's a truism. It's that politics is people, fundamentally, and people are connected with relationships. I mean, relationships are a very, very big part of this. And it's not just with each other, not just with members, but kind of everyone's connected in some way, right? And the more that you can get connected, the more that you're able to know the right people in a certain fight to be able to make the right argument, maybe, and sometimes maybe it's grassroots pressure, sometimes maybe it's just a direct conversation or a text or an email. But we're in the season right now where obviously members of Congress are going to be running for re-election coming up in 2020. They're going to be really, really accessible, more so than any other time during election season. They're going to be more likely to give out contact information. They're going to be happy to see you around at events, introduce themselves, get to know you. Be sure you just introduce yourself. Like, don't ever be intimidated. And even if they're not members of Congress yet, build relationships with your state lawmakers or your county councilman or whoever it may be who may be interested in running for office at some point, for higher office at some point. You never know who's going to end up in that position later. And like you said, the more people you know, the more people you know. You never know. You might be good friends with your future congressman. So build those relationships, stay up to date on the issues, but ultimately go out there and take action and try to be as effective as possible. So I know that you mentioned a little bit about the Sentinel program. We do want to urge you, if you're interested in any of this information or getting more in the weeds with accountability or legislation or process, come by. We've got a table out in the hallway. We're going to be there the rest of the day. Come say hey if you're interested in getting more info about the Sentinel program. Stop by. We'd love to tell you more about it and help get you involved any way that we can. I think the important thing here is that you know, the food fight that goes on in the media is always going to be there. It's going to take place no matter what, right? Like, we need to focus on what we can focus on. I mean, all it takes is the president to tweet something and the media is going to go nuts over it, right? Trust me, that's going to happen whether we are engaged on that in the moment or not. If we keep in front of us what matters, keep our eyes on the ball, which is policy, which is really getting conservative principle put in place, we can be really, really effective. So if you're interested in hearing more, or if you have questions for us, I know we're running out of time here, we'll be out at the table, so feel free to stop by, say hey. But thank you guys for having us, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day.
All right, so if you've noticed, one of the things that we've been talking about, and if you look at some of the sponsors we have, very, very concerned with and talking about what's going on with social media companies and technology companies and conservatives, and also very concerned with this, it terrifies me, the thought that we may be giving Washington power to regulate companies because we don't like what we think they're doing to us, that the Democrats will then use against us. And I want to talk about a lot of the stuff that's happening in Washington in the technology sphere. And full disclosure, again, you can see it on the back, Google and Microsoft both sponsoring the conference. And one quick word on one of our sponsors here, Facebook. Did you know they're the one technology company that doesn't do business in China because they don't think that the communist Chinese should have access to your data? Just remember that when people go on these tirades about social media. Listen, I didn't want Twitter to sponsor the conference. You know that line, that story in the Bible about how Jesus cast the demons out of the man, and they all went into the pigs, and they rolled down the hill and they drowned. What the Bible leaves out is that after the demons came out of the dead pigs, they all got Twitter accounts. So, yeah, I mean, you don't have to believe me, just go see it for yourself. But I do want to thank Google and Facebook for wanting to have a relationship with conservatives and for wanting to reach out. And I am concerned with some of the, I think, unfair attacks that are happening in the technology space. And I do think that they're not always perfect, they're not always right, mistakes are made. And I do think in some cases with some companies, Twitter, that the mistakes are always made against conservatives and not against progressives, and I think that's notable. But I also don't think we should be scared of these technology companies. And I wanted to invite up, they're not just sponsoring, I would have them here, maybe I shouldn't say I'd have him here anyway, even if they weren't sponsoring, but they are. I want to bring on stage Jesse Blumenthal, who's the head of technology, innovation, and policy for the Koch network, because he knows a great deal about this subject, and I really want to have this conversation about this. Jesse, thank you so much for coming. Thank you. So, I mean, let's get to it out of the gate. I think that there are some justifiable concerns among conservatives about some of the stuff happening in the tech space and social media, censorship, and regulation. But I'm also deeply worried that conservatives, a lot of them now have this mindset that we need a solution to come from government, completely ignoring the fact that one day Democrats will be in charge of all this power we want the FCC and the FTC to have again.
I think you're totally right to be concerned about that. You know, there are, I think, real concerns that people have expressed about bias in content moderation, who's making decisions, how are they happening. And those are good conversations to have. But just because you've identified a problem doesn't mean that government has the solution to it.
Amen.
And there's a real risk of us falling into this trap of thinking that things can be centrally planned by just the smartest group of bureaucrats if we can just get them in the right room in DC. And that, I think, is just a recipe for disaster. Here's, you know, I talk to folks all the time about this issue. It's something that I care about. It's something that all the groups in our organization work on. There are, I don't know, 97 Democrats running for president these days. Many of them on stages in lots of places. And, you know, of course, the president's running for re-election. Here's the test that I use. If you picture in your mind the candidate that you most disagree with, the person you really don't want to see elected, and you picture in your mind the issue that just drives you nuts every time you hear them talking about it, and you're comfortable with that person on that issue setting the terms for online debate, then yeah, we should look to DC for a solution here. We should look to a federal technology speech commission to tell us what the rules for online debate should be. But if that gives you pause, if you only like that solution when your guy's in charge, if you only like that solution, if you happen to agree with the people on the policy issue that's being debated or the cultural issue that's being debated or whatever's being debated, then you're just setting yourself up for long-term failure after failure of being disappointed and being silenced.
Well, in that regard, though, I think there's some legitimate concern among conservatives that frequently when it comes to social media, particularly on some platforms who are not sponsoring this event, I mean, for example, I had my account on Twitter suspended for 24 hours for saying that Elizabeth Warren was going to introduce the Wampum Act, Wrecking American Prosperity, and I forget what the rest of it, but Wrecking American Prosperity with Marxism Act, the Wampum Act. It apparently insulted her based on her ethnicity. Well, how? She says she's not even a Native American. But my account was suspended for 24 hours. I would note that you also have Louis Farrakhan's account has yet to be suspended for calling Jews roaches.
Yeah, right. So, and I bet you we could sit here all day and list the examples of things that are frustrating or annoying. The question is, what do you want to do about it, right? And so there's a temptation, and it's a real one that, quite frankly, unfortunately, you hear from the left and the right, to say, just because we've thought of this new problem, we need some new rule to deal with it. We have laws in this country that exist. We have laws that ban fraud. If a company tells you, here's the agreement we're getting into with you, and here are the promises we're making to you, these are the terms of the bargain, and then they do something else, we have laws against that. Fraud is not legal, right? And nor should it be. But the idea that we need some sort of new federal censorship commission, that's going to improve the situation in online speech is frankly wrong. And we know that because, quite frankly, we've tried this before with radio. So when radio launched in the early 1900s, you had a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different backgrounds, many of whom with really strong political views. Folks on the right and on the left. You had labor organizers and, in fact, community groups and churches all running radio stations. And by the early 1920s, you started to get the three-letter call sign stations that were building up this network. And by 1926, you started to have the first series of network of radio stations, which lets folks like you broadcast all across Georgia, not just on the one station you're at. And there was a politician who started getting really worried. And he started getting really worried because suddenly one person from somewhere in the country could speak to lots and lots of people very quickly and with no intermediaries and with no one sort of checking what was going on. That politician was Herbert Hoover. And Herbert Hoover at the time was Secretary of Commerce, and so he got together with his friends, a couple of whom were powerful US senators, and they passed two bills in 1927. And what those bills did was set a federal licensing regime for radio, and they set equal time rules. And effectively what it did was it made it impossible to run radio stations that had opinionated content, that had controversial content. And so what you got over the ensuing decades, from basically the 20s until 1987 when it was repealed by the Reagan FCC, was a fairness doctrine. And what the fairness doctrine resulted in was only stations that had sort of relatively broad, non-controversial entertainment programming were able to broadcast. But if you wanted to actually state your opinion, if you wanted to go out and advocate, if you wanted to build an audience of people of like-minded values, that was impossible. And we suffered through this 60-year span of government-imposed censorship. And it wasn't the type of censorship that says, okay, you can say A but not B, right? This side of the issue but not that side of the issue. It was the type of censorship that said, no one can have strongly held political beliefs. It's just not the type of business you can run. And what we've seen since that repeal in 1987 is an explosion in diverse, loud, engaged political voices. Like, Erick, your show could not exist prior to these rules. And what is shocking to me is after one of the greatest deregulatory accomplishments of the 20th century, liberalizing the airways in a way that allowed people to express their views, we're now here in 2019 debating whether we need to impose basically the same system for the internet. It's nuts.
Yeah, it absolutely is, I think. And yet you have a lot of people who look at social media and technology companies and say, well, there are a bunch of liberals from San Francisco running liberal companies, hiring liberals, they all hate us, so we're going to get censored. When a lot of data shows that conservatives are at parity or better on social media, even with our liberal corporate overlords, supposedly. How do you view this issue, though, and address the conservative concerns that, well, you know, they really are out to get us on these social media platforms?
So here's what I'd say. I'd say two things. The first is, if you look in a given day on what the top news sources are on Facebook, you'll see that it's Fox News and Daily Wire and overwhelmingly right-of-center concerns. And you know, as someone who often shares those views, I think that's great. Even if it weren't true, I still think the idea of the government coming in and telling a private company who you can and can't do business with is wrong. You know, if we believe, as a movement, that a cake baker in Colorado can't be compelled to use his expressive talents in designing wedding cakes to make a cake for a gay couple when it violates his religious conviction, then, you know, Facebook gets to decide if they bake the cake or not. And quite frankly, it's really disappointing to me that so many folks on the right have decided that the appropriate solution here is to have what David French called the daddy state government come in and tell these companies to stop being mean to me instead of doing something about it, right? And to be clear, there are real problems here. So I want to give you a concrete example. One of the things that Senator Hawley, who's been pushing a lot of these, from our perspective, pretty bad ideas, has been vocal about, is he's worried about the impact on children and families. And that's fair. That's totally fair, right? We, for the first time, have a generation of people in this country who are raising children, and their kids are coming to them, and they want to have a conversation about how long should my child be using a cell phone for? Is screen time a problem? Is online bullying a problem? And how do I deal with that as a parent? And what's new is, unlike other types of parenting questions, it's not like you can go and ask your parents, hey, how did you deal with this 30 years ago when I was growing up? I say this as a soon-to-be father of a baby girl who's been thinking about these issues. And so, that's a real challenge. But just because you've identified a problem doesn't mean there's a government solution. So one of the things that we've been supporting through the Charles Koch Foundation is a partnership with a group called the Family Online Safety Institute. What they've put together is a program called Good Digital Parenting. You can go and Google it or, DuckDuckGo it, and you can find Good Digital Parenting online. And what it is 7 simple steps for parents on how to talk to their kids about using technology, right? So just because there's a governance question, how do we want to deal with cell phones in our children's lives, doesn't mean that we have a government problem.
Well, I mean, and just to clarify here, I don't actually talk to my children anymore. I just text them. It's honestly, so we flat out in our family drew the line with our kids not having cell phones. So 13 and 10, they don't need a cell phone. And I took my daughter on an overnight trip to Atlanta. We live an hour south of here. Came up here, we were staying overnight. Had 3 girls in the car with me, and none of them were talking to each other. They were texting each other in the car. There was no noise. My daughter in the front was having to talk to them.
You're saying this is a bad thing or a good thing?
No, but my daughter in the front was having to talk to them because she couldn't text, and I realized she is being shut out of her entire circle of friends because she doesn't have a device that can text. It's like, I guess I need to loosen up a little bit on this because, and it's just, you're right, it's not something we had as kids because we didn't have these texting screen devices, but now she's really mad because she can text, but I'm taking advantage of the technology myself to block certain websites and to use the built-in screen time on the iOS devices from Apple, and it certainly works, and I don't know that we need a government solution. I do personally continue to have the concern, well, one, I would say, I know people who build their entire businesses reliant on either a Facebook or a Google or a Twitter or what have you, and I don't think we should surrender the foundations of a business to another company that may change its rules or algorithms or what have you. But at the same time, I maintain there is a real level of concern when you hear some of the stories that come out of Silicon Valley and whatnot, when you see even employees at some of these companies, even Amazon, for example, deeply upset that the companies are doing business with the government, that there are clearly people who don't like conservatives who work there. And I also want to rein in the conservative impulse of, well, we own the government right now, we should go after them, because one day you're not. Look at what happened with the IRS and the Tea Party groups.
Yeah. I thought Vice President Pence yesterday said it best when he said that we should have faith in the American people to see through the noise and choose freedom, right? I can't guarantee you that every outcome you like, you would prefer in the marketplace is going to come to be. I can't guarantee you that businesses that you favor are going to succeed and thrive. I say this, by the way, full disclosure, as a former employee of Blockbuster, right? Things change in the marketplace. But I do really worry about the government coming in and saying we know best. So one other sort of historical example. How many folks in this room have heard of Edwin Armstrong? Okay, so 2 hands. So Edwin Armstrong, who liked to be called Major Armstrong, was a chronic inventor. He invented all the time. He was served in the US Army in both World War I, World War II, and so when he went back to Columbia as a physics professor, would like to be called Major Armstrong. In 1934, Edwin Armstrong strapped his new invention to the top of the Empire State Building, and he invented FM radio. And what FM radio solved at the time, and especially in the 30s, was that AM signals, when the thunderstorms would roll in, would get super staticky. And the breadth of audio sound that can be transmitted over AM was not as wide as wideband FM. And so jazz didn't sound as good. In fact, he sort of very famously put on this demonstration when he was marketing this technology, where he came in with an AM set and an FM set and played the same jazz song on both. And you could just hear the vibrancy of the tone on FM radio. And these things started selling like hotcakes. So in the 30s, about 500,000 Armstrong radios were sold in the United States. And these were very expensive at the time. And you had stations, primarily in the Northeast, starting to pop up. And it was a wave of innovation in popular communications and audio technology. Well, some folks in Washington, D.C. didn't like it very much. And so right at the end of World War II in 1945, they invented this thing called the sunspot theory. So it was basically a nonsense excuse that solar flares would interfere with FM signals in a way that they wouldn't interfere with AM signals. But it was just a pretext, right? They didn't like his new technology because you had all of these new stations and all of these new people suddenly being connected. And they didn't tell him exactly he couldn't do it. What they did was they moved all of the spectrum that had been allocated to FM radio to an entirely different part of the dial. And so suddenly, overnight, 500,000 radios stopped working. You had really, really expensive paperweights. And Armstrong's life starts to go into a tailspin. He gets into a big fight with RCA. And by 1954, he commits suicide. And it's because the government came in and decided to pick winners and losers in the marketplace and protect incumbent AM broadcasters over this FM competitor. And it wouldn't be until about a decade later in the 1960s when FM radio really started taking off in the United States. And so what you had was a 3-decade delay in better audio signal and more people being able to listen to the music that they want. Contrast that with the way the iPhone rolled out, right? Where you had spectrum controlled by private entities, where you had Apple being able to come out with a, quite frankly, like once-in-a-generation consumer product that puts a super computer in so many of our pockets, and within, quite frankly, like a very short time span from invention to deployment, you have a product that is now, at least in the United States, relatively ubiquitous. That doesn't happen if you have to go to the government and say, "Mother, may I?" That doesn't happen if you have to prove that, absolutely the iPhone is better than the old BlackBerries or the old flip phones. And the truth is, the iPhone's not the only phone in the market, right? Like there are plenty of other devices made by other manufacturers, and different consumers are going to have different preferences, right? What is right for your daughter and your family might not be right for my daughter and my family, and that's okay. That's the difference between a top-down government-imposed solution that says Washington knows best and here's how technology needs to evolve, versus a bottom-up approach that, as Vice President Pence said, puts faith in the American people that they will choose freedom.
In that regard, one of my other concerns in this sphere, in addition to I do think conservatives have some legitimate angst, at the same time, I notice a lot of technology companies are embracing the idea of regulation, and my concern is they embrace regulations, the regulations are written anticipating them, thereafter no new person can come up and David can no longer take out Goliath because Goliath has built the regulatory structure to protect himself.
It's deeply dangerous, and it's something we work very actively at the state level in 36 states and at the federal level to oppose. Regulation benefits incumbents, period, full stop. The biggest fans of complex, burdensome regulatory regimes are big companies because they can hire the lawyers and they can hire the lobbyists and they can hire the accountants and they can deal with it, and you end up building a regulatory moat around your business. At the same time, there's a lot of fear-mongering about size, and I just want to put this in context, right? Because often when you and I have this conversation, with folks have this type of conversation, someone will just come up and say, and I anticipate someone after this panel coming up to me and saying, but Google's just so big, but Facebook's just so big, they're so powerful, surely this time is different. And the truth is that if you look at the advertising market, which is where those two companies tend to compete. Internet-based advertising is large, right? It's about 40% of all advertising. But when you look at it as a share of advertising and marketing, it's much smaller, right? It's about 18%. And why do I say ad-in marketing? Well, because the inherent business model in digital advertising is I've got a message or a product and I want to get it in front of a consumer. And so I have some piece of information about that consumer and I'm going to put my message in front of them and that's how I'm going to reach them, right? That's how a Facebook ad works. That's how an ad on YouTube works. It's also, by the way, how direct marketing works. It's how mailers work, right? When a product company buys shelf space at Walmart and wants Tide Pods at eye level so you see them as you're walking down the aisle, that's very similar to having a digital ad on your phone in a prominent place. So you see that Tide Pod and you click buy and add it to your Amazon cart. And so, yes, companies are large. That's why we have competition enforcement. Yes, companies should be honest with consumers about what the terms of the deal are. That's why we have laws against fraud. But the idea that we need some special new law just because the business model has evolved a bit or the technology has evolved a bit is a recipe for stopping innovation in its tracks. Because the folks who are best equipped to see that competitive threat coming and go lobby their favorite regulator are the folks who have the old technology, not the new upstart.
Well, I think a great example of this is the internet sales tax that for years, it was the major big box stores wanted the internet sales tax because they thought it would hurt Amazon. The moment Amazon got big enough, Amazon's like, hey, we want the internet sales tax because we don't want mom and pop shops to get online now that the cost of doing business online has gone down.
And this is where consumer choice, so you're totally right. And when Amazon put warehouses close to people to provide near like 1 day or 2 day delivery, they suddenly had tax obligations in all of these states. So they didn't mind everyone else being competed with. Look, when I want to go buy toilet paper, Amazon's a great place to do it. Boxes show up at our house all the time. When I want to go find something that's a little more unique, something that's a little more crafty, quite frankly, Amazon's not a great place to do that. There are lots of small retailers around the country and around the world, and some of them use the same digital marketing tools that we've been talking about to reach out, but others of them use Etsy and Pinterest and other platforms. And you know what? As a consumer, sometimes I just want the box of the big brand stuff that I know exactly what I'm getting, and sometimes I want something that's different. And both of those things are good, right? In some sense, what we're having is not an economic debate. We're having a moral debate. Folks are saying that people in government in DC know better than you about how to make buying decisions with your own money. They're saying that they know better than you about how to make reading decisions about what news content you want to read. And I keep going back to the line that Mike Pence said yesterday, but he's absolutely right about it, right? Like this is about whether or not you value individual choice and individual responsibility. So if the internet, and then I'll end my little rant, but if the internet has taught us anything, it's that humanity, warts and all, can be reflected online just as it can offline. And you know what? Sometimes people are terrible to each other, and they do awful things, and they bully people and they harass people, and that's been going on playgrounds long before Twitter was around. And when we take that conversation online, a lot of the same problems that happen offline happen. And so I'm not intentionally being Pollyanna-ish, right? It's not like there's nothing wrong on the internet. The question is, when people are terrible to each other on the internet, who do you want to hold responsible? And I think individuals are responsible for their actions, and not the tools they use.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And to go full circle in our conversation, it troubles me greatly that conservatives could look like they're getting a win here when they're actually surrendering because they're imposing regulations that, God forbid, Elizabeth Warren were to get elected president, what would she do? I mean, look at the Obama administration and Tea Party groups in the IRS. Now suddenly you have the FCC. Being a guy in radio, having the FCC reimpose the equal time rule because they don't like conservatives. The Democrats have been trying it forever. And now they target social media companies in a way that no one can ever grow and compete and build a new social media enterprise because the existing ones are under regulation, but also you've got Democrats in charge of them saying, oh, no, this conservative really, his account did deserve to be banned, and this progressive over here did not.
Yeah, if the next time you hear a politician with an R after their name saying they have this great new idea for how to regulate speech online, for how to regulate the development of technology, for how to regulate the internet, substitute in Elizabeth Warren or your favorite Democrat, and if you're still comfortable with the plan, then we just have a legitimate disagreement about policy, and we can have that argument. But if you only like it when your guy's in office, you're just setting yourself up to be disappointed, and not just disappointed, to be meaningfully curtailed in your freedoms.
Well, and you know, I want to say that I do recognize some of the moral concerns that people like Senator Hawley and others are raising on these issues, and the great unknown now, and the fact that I do think there are a lot of companies who have invested a lot of time to understand psychology to ensure that we stick around. But I also think that if we're giving the government our parental duties, we're ceding the ground to the government to tell us how to be parents and how to regulate our kids' time on the internet. One of the great examples of this is my daughter's 13. She loves photography, she loves art. She wanted an Instagram account 2 years ago, and I was okay with her having an Instagram account as long as it was private, as long as all of our family followed her so we would all be able to monitor and see, and as long as we approved each person who followed her account. Those were the ground rules. Well, I did not realize that I, as a parent, had to lie to Instagram to create the account, because the government has this Child Online Privacy Protection Act where parents have to do certain things if your child is younger than 13. And the way social media accounts interpreted that to keep themselves out of trouble is, if you were under 13, you cannot have a social media account. Mm-hmm. So my 10-year-old who wants to play on the Xbox with friends over the internet can't, unless we lie about his age. My daughter, who wanted a private Instagram account, couldn't unless we lied about her age. And what's that teaching my kids? That dad is lying about their age so that they can do this thing that I, as a parent, am perfectly comfortable and capable overseeing and monitoring.
So I want to thank you for admitting before this large audience that not only have you been lying to the tech companies, you've
Yes.
probably committed federal felonies.
Oh, totally
this.
so.
Like,
Happy to do it
I'm not
online.
joking, by the way, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, if you want to look it
yeah.
up. Right? And it's something we just take for granted all the time. And it's the exact manifestation of, if you turn to Washington to raise your kids, if you turn to Washington for parenting advice, you're going to get these top-down rules that say, over 13, okay, under 13, here's this bureaucratic system that no one wants to comply with. And it's not that there shouldn't be special protections for children. There should be. I think that's a reasonable place for the government to have some limited role. But the problem is that when you create these sort of complex regulatory regimes, you either get what you just described, which is everyone basically ignores it or fudges around it or enters the wrong birth year or something like that. Or you get just real stymied innovation in products that, you know, the market for 10-year-olds to 13-year-olds is very different than the market for 15 to 18-year-olds. And it would actually be good if we had companies that were thinking about those products instead of just saying, you know what, the government's made it too hard, under 13, you can't just sign up.
Well, as a parent, as someone who thinks about conservative philosophy, I also think that there is a danger inherent in these things where we lose respect for the rule of law when we see so often the laws are designed in a way that we have to break them in order to live laws that make no sense. You devalue the regulatory structure and the legal structure.
So there's a great book by Harvey Silverglate, who's a criminal defense lawyer up in Boston, who's the co-founder of FIRE, which is a terrific organization that advocates for free speech rights on college campuses across the United States. And Harvey Silverglate wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day. And the basic argument in the book is the average American unwittingly commits 3 federal felonies a day. And not only, so I agree with you that it devalues a respect for the rule of law, which is important. It also meaningfully empowers government to sort of hang a sword of Damocles above your head, right? Because if everyone is guilty of a crime at some point throughout the day, then if they want to get you on something else, you've raised Lois Lerner in the IRS scandal a couple of times, there's always something out there for a creative prosecutor. You know, there's this story that used to be told about the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York that the senior prosecutors would take the junior prosecutors out to drinks. And the game was one of the senior prosecutors would name a celebrity, and then the junior prosecutors had to come up with the most creative crimes they could theoretically charge them under. And that should scare all of us. At the end of the day, this debate is a microcosm of a broader discussion. And I sort of want to leave this here. For basically all of human history, until about the year 1800, people's lives from their great-grandparents to their great-grandchildren, in terms of the quality of life that they lived, was basically flatlined. If you looked at life expectancy, if you looked at technological innovations, if you looked at what people lived on in a day, per person, per capita, per day consumption, what it cost to live in real terms was $3 a day. And in the last 200 years or so, there has been an explosion of growth. So worldwide, that number is up 1,000% in terms of what the average person lives on in a given day. And in developed countries like the United States, that's up 3,000%. That it literally lifted billions of people out of poverty. So what changed around 1800? What changed around 1800, and there are all these sort of like pop social science books, and some people will say it was salt, it was coal, it was rule of law, it was institutions, all of these things played a role. There was a cultural shift that happened. Deirdre McCloskey, the economist, talks about it in terms of we started inventing. If you had called someone an innovator 300-400 years ago, it was basically a synonym for a heretic. Galileo was an innovator. Didn't end particularly well for him. An innovator meant someone who challenged the power and the orthodoxy of the state, and were usually swapped down. There's been just a swing of the cultural pendulum over the last 200 years where innovation, discovering new things, finding ways to better your life and better someone else's life as a result, is now something that we embrace as a culture. And one of the things that I worry a lot about is that we're starting to lose that. Because I think the types of things that have improved people's lives in medicine, in transportation, in being able to stay in touch with friends and family, in being able to maintain connections, beyond just the small town in which you live, those things require two things. It requires a culture that embraces innovation, and it requires a policy environment that allows for lots and lots of experimentation, because most of the new ideas suck, and they'll fail. And that's good. That's how we find the ones that work. It's that dynamism and experimentation that allows us to seize on the next great invention. And that's the reason why I care so much about standing up to top-down government solutions and standing up for the rights of people to try new things and try and see what they can come up with next.
Jesse Blumenthal, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was good. You guys get a lunch break, so do I. This afternoon, the governor of Tennessee, newly elected, is going to be here. We've got a number of candidates who are running for office. We've got some great content this afternoon. Look forward to seeing you all as well.